In 1959, we all went to, we couldn't go to the high school prom as gay dates, so I got my former dates together and we went to Havana, Cuba to join the revolution, to upstage the prom. And we called Mr. Kaiser of the North Shore Sentinel every day and told him what it was like on the road to join the revolution. Then we got down there.
So you did make it there?
We made it. We made it. We flew Q Airlines. I still have the plane ticket. Q Airlines from Key West over to Havana. And we were the last plane that landed because as our plane was landing, the dictator of Cuba was taking off. And so we there, but we quickly discovered they were using live ammunition in that revolution. And just as a way of advice, don't ever join a war where they use live ammunition. It's not healthy. And so then we got drunk and sick. Since we weren't joining the revolution, we drank a lot of Cuban rum and hung around the hotel and got sick.
So it was legal to travel to Cuba at that time?
Yeah. Yep.
Were Marxists?
Well, I had gone, I would go later, not then, I would go later to Columbia University to study economics under Salvador Allende. And then I was on the campus of Columbia studying. See, Salvador Allende had a certain amount of appeal because he was the guy that could have revolution without killing people, non-bloodshed. And that has an appeal to a young college student. And so I went up there, and I couldn't afford to enroll, but he let me monitor his class if I promised not to sit in a chair. I had to sit on the stairs. It was amphitheater kind of class. And I was walking across Columbia one afternoon. This great big bear of a guy dropped his books, and he had too many books to carry, so I picked him up and I carried him home with him. That turned out to be C. Wright Mills. And C. Wright Mills said, "Oh, son, the revolution is not economics. The revolution is psychoanalysis." So I said, "Oh, okay," and I followed that goose chase until I got to the point where Freud says we must make a dogma out of psychoanalysis. And having been a teenage evangelist, I had all the dogma I could stand for a lifetime. So I said, well, this is not for me either. And then I went to University of Indiana to study sexual behavior under the remainders, people that were around after Kinsey left. I actually enrolled at Indiana. And I studied sexual behavior under Karen Horney, Evelyn Hooker, Clarence Tripp, and they all became friends of mine. And yeah. And
Did you get a degree?
no, I still don't have a degree.
But you majored in psychology?
It was actually cultural anthropology, but I'm more of a sociologist than a
I like
psychologist.
You're more of a practicing cultural
Anthropologist. Yeah, I'm kind of an amateur cultural anthropologist. When I went to prison, I could have stayed there forever if they'd given me enough legal pads to chart the pecking order. I wasn't in a hurry to get out. Actually, I was more afraid to get out than I had been to go in because I was doing useful things. I was feeding my head,
You read a lot of books?
read a lot of books, run the prison construction business and the maintenance business, and studied the culture. Oh, of course. You can't do that without becoming institutionalized. It's the nature of institutions to have that kind of effect on you. And but that's not necessarily a bad thing. When you're actually in prison, it's just a different way to live. It's neither good nor bad. It's just how you live. And I did that. Originally, I was going to do it for 160 years, but I wound up doing it in 4 years, 4 months, and 17 days.
So it wasn't a dramatic experience?
Not for me. I mean, well, it was when I first went in. When you go in with a number like a 20 consecutive 8-year sentences or 160 years, the first thing you think about is how do I survive? Not meaning how do I stay here long enough to get out, but how do I live? So it's total immersion. And in a couple of weeks you figure that out, and then the question is how do I prosper? And then you start working on that prosper thing, and you prosper. And I did that, and I was an outside trustee. I did all the maintenance and construction planning and supervising. I had my own truck. I could travel from one unit to another unit by myself without any trouble.
So you don't remember any kind of fear when you went in?
Well, how long?
Well, men aren't socialized to really know they're feeling fear.
Well, no. I will say I'm a gay guy, so that don't count. Of course, I was fearful, but right away I met an old convict who said, "Son, here are the rules of the road," and it's in my single character performance piece, Ray Hill, the Prison Years. I talk about Red Alexander a lot because he was so full of bullshit. I mean, he just lied and all that. But he gave me enough basic information that allowed me to survive in that environment. And I not only survived, but I prospered. And then I got out. I was more afraid to get out than I had been to go in. There's a lot of death. Now,
Ray, what gets people into prison?
stupidity mostly. Stupidity is a big deal. Drugs, alcohol, their own abuse. I mean, I have a stump speech that I tell convicts that I can't do anything about the way your old stepdaddy abused you. That's not anything anybody. You can't. The clock hands go only one direction. You can't reverse the direction and do anything about that. But the anger builds up, and they lash out, either in ways that are destructive of other people or that are self-destructive, and they wind up in prison and frequently find themselves in traps that they can't see an escape from. Once you go to prison, you will either adapt to that society or you won't survive. And if you adapt to that society, you're specifically ill-adapted to live anywhere else. So they spend their lives there because that's what they know. And they say, well, we're going to make prison so tough it's going to scare people not to come back. That's the wrong kind of pig-headed thinking. You know, the tougher you make prisons, the higher the recidivism rate. Why? Because they've got to adapt to survive in that tough environment, and then that becomes home. To a lot of people, prison has just become their mother. And they keep going back home in their return trips to prison. That's where their friends are. That's where they are somebody. I dealt with the same thing when I got out. I had been a big man on campus in prison. And whenever I got out, I was absolutely convinced that I was going to be nobody for the rest of my life. And I would have been. I would have been nobody.
How did you change that direction?
Well, I had certain advantages. I had helped found KPFT before I went to prison. I had learned in the toughest territory in the world, inside prison, that being openly gay can be an asset rather than a liability.
Can you talk about that for a sec?
Well, the popular mythology is that you go to prison, and if you're gay, you don't have low status, you have negative status. I mean, below the line status. But if you actually get there, and you're openly gay in their face, and you not only survive, but you prosper, it becomes an asset because your being openly gay brings up the recognition of a trait that gay people honor, and that is courage. If you've got the guts to stand up and tell people, I am queer, and if you don't like it, just get over it. That becomes a positive thing because it takes a negative aspect and makes that a positive aspect courage. And so if you do that, then you get over the aspect that gay people, you know what was wrong with gay people in the 60s and the 70s is that they believed what everybody else said about them. And if you believe what everybody else said about you, then you thought you were a piece of crap. But if you can go to the toughest territory in the world and not only survive but glean respect, then all of a sudden that myth breaks down. And you become, you realize that all of that negativity is crap that you have bought from other sources that you don't have to believe. And so that's why I came out looking at free world gay people saying, you're stupid. You need somebody to teach you about your own self-worth. And that became a life's work, and I did that. Actually, I started in the late 60s, but I did that for 40 years, and then I retired and left that to the people that I had brought up to a level of self-acceptance that during most of my life, I'm the only person that experienced that.
So,
and my trip to prison just reinforced my belief system that it's okay to be queer.
and doing the work of loving other people gave you the energy to do it.
You know, at the bargaining table, every one of you has been on a bargaining committee. You know how you've been getting beat up now for years, where people are asking you for givebacks. You have to pay higher premiums, co-pays, deductibles. Years ago, you could be at a negotiating table, you could be talking about wages. That's not the way it is today. You're always talking about trying to desperately hold on to what you have, and people keep losing it. NAFTA has created downward pressure on wages and on benefits. But health care in and of itself is in a crisis in this country. You'll hear in this presidential campaign all the candidates talking about universal health care. You know what? Even the insurance companies are for universal health care as long as they get subsidized by the government so that they can keep charging the premiums, co-pays, and deductibles. There's only one solution to this system, and it's the Conyers-Kucinich bill, H.R. 676, which provides for universal, single-payer, not-for-profit Medicare for all. This is the solution that will finally give the American people health care. Standard of care, we're just not getting it. And again, you know, some of the leaders of my party are saying, well, you know, we can't really pass that. We can't get it through Congress. But they have ideas about what will get through Congress. Government subsidizing the insurance industry. Oh, that'll get through Congress in a heartbeat. We're at a moment in American history where you can play a singular role in reclaiming this government that you helped build with your tax dollars, that you helped build through the power of your belief in this country. Because labor and the American flag have a real connection here. Because the values of labor, of courage, of bravery, of hard work are really what this country's about.
How'd you start working with Brian?
Well, I spent some time, and I'd heard about the show, but I didn't have a radio, so I couldn't listen to it. And then when I got out, one of the first things I got was a radio, clock radio, you know, so I could, you know. And I happened to be tuning across the dial, and I just happened to catch it when he said prison show. And I listened to the rest of the show, and I was fascinated. So after the show, I called him. This is when the show was on Sunday afternoons. And he said, well, come on down next Sunday, you know, we can, you know. So, you know, I came down, you know, and after a while, I learned how to run the board and everything. And I've kind of become like an old cat that you pet and feed. You can't get rid of me now.
What else do you do? Do you work with him in other ways besides the radio show?
Every once in a while, we'll get involved in other projects.
I know Ray's really skilled at
operating the levers of government, making government work for people.
Yes.
Can you tell me any stories about that?
Well, there's been a couple of times that I've had run-ins with police officers, and I'd call him and give him the name and badge number, and he'd call their supervisor, and things get straightened out from there.
Mm-hmm.
So he's been a very good friend.
Thanks for talking. I'll talk to you some more if you don't mind.
Okay.
I'm making a documentary with him, and it's about.
Who are you with?
I work for the Public Access Channel. I've worked
Okay.
there for 20 years. And I've known Ray a long time. We're making a documentary is found in editing, so I don't know what it's going to be, but it's in general. I think the general idea is that unintended consequences. I mean, you build a criminal justice system for a reason. Are we getting, is society getting what it wants out of this system? That's kind of my.
About the only thing they're getting is their money spent. Foolishly.
In the worst way. You're so nice. I didn't want to run off with it, and I apologize, Ray.
Okay.
This will help some of the Hispanics at work understand what this is about, because they know.
Now, Linda, did you put on a separate list the names you picked up on Peckerwood Hill?
Well, they're on here. You sure? I have to find it now, and you'll have to, because we're trying to divide it up. 333.
If you can, that's
Okay, so let's just find where it is.
An idea, rather than try to make a big division thing out of it, when you see it's the next one,
Just read
hold
it.
your hand up, she'll point
Yeah,
the,
we'll all have copies of pay.
she'll point the finger at you and it's done.
Okay. Well, you're just orchestrating this just fabulous, Wayne.
He's the director.
I run a
I'm the writer,
warehouse.
the producer, he's the director.
No, she's the director, believe that. I just remembering the way we did it last year, and it turned out so well. Last year's program, last year's Memorial Day program, Ray submitted for one of the station awards.
Oh, okay, that's right.
And,
We don't have.
It was probably one of the most favorably received shows. That Ray said he was getting mail for 6 months, yeah.
But you don't have a copy
Right,
machine.
and this is the amazing thing about the Ray Hill Show, is it's the only open and respected show in the penitentiary.
Well, we may have to just pass
Been
around
a-
papers.
I've been a fan of Ray Hill's for
Basically, it's gonna be
20 years.
3.
20
And
years.
it's like
We couldn't
it's,
get it up at Cofield. Too far
Telling
north.
Ray the name of the
But,
person being remembered.
It's
is
an honest, open,
the name in that little
and prison-orientated show.
paragraph, not
We do.
underlined as the person who submitted it.
We do have rights.
You know, like.
Let me make sure that I've got the box cleaned out.
Just play the hours
worth of, blues. I didn't even
Ray,
look
when
at
did you start this show?
27 years ago. I started it in the last week of March in 1980. I was general manager of the radio station, and I was the first ex-convict and the first openly homosexual person to manage a broadcast facility in the United States. The manager before me had just wandered off, and nobody missed her for 2 weeks, which gives you some idea how important managers are around here. And somebody said, "Have you seen Judy?" And I said, "No." And nobody had seen her, and her office was locked. And somebody said, "Well, maybe she's dead in there." Well, we didn't smell anything, but since I was the only burglar on the staff, I broke in, and she had left us a note in her locked office saying, "I'm getting tired of this fucking job. I'm not getting paid anything. It's a lot of responsibility, a lot of work, and there's not enough money in the bank account to pay me, so I'm leaving." And it was dated 2 weeks before. So we cast lots, and I lost and became general manager. And so we announced at the Pacifica Foundation that KPFT had a new manager. We didn't have an operating local board, and so I took over, and they notified the lawyer, and I said, "No, he can't do that." And they said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, you can't manage a broadcast facility unless you're a person of good moral character. And this guy's an ex-convict and a pervert. He's openly queer. I mean, people like that can't manage broadcast facilities." And so I wrote the lawyers and I said, just notify the FCC that radio station KPFT is operating in violation of that rule. which had passed sometime in the 30s. And so they just notified him, sent him a letter, and I kept running the radio station. And they got a letter back from the FCC saying, oh, we'll put it on the agenda for the next commission meeting. And would you like to make a presentation? The lawyers called, now we've got to go make a presentation. I said, no, that's an invitation. That's not an order. So send them a letter thanking them very much for the opportunity, but declining. And why would we go over there and give them something to argue with? I'm thinking like a convict inside the jail in the writ room. See, regular lawyers don't think like that. That's one of the reasons I say that one of the great blessings of my life is that I'm not a lawyer. Therefore, I don't have to think like one. And so then they said, okay, and they had their agenda item, and they met, and they notified us. The board decided to exempt KPFT in Houston from that rule, and the matter will be finally resolved at the next commission meeting. They meet about every quarter, so all this is a lot of time. And when we got that letter, I realized I'm going to be here, and I can do anything I want to as long as it's radio. And so I started doing the prison show. And it didn't work out. I mean, I was going to do a show to educate the unwashed public about the criminal justice system, cops and courts and jails and prison, probation, parole, that sort of thing. But I never got that audience. The audience I got were convicts and convicts' families who already knew all of the things I was planning to talk about the show. And you don't do radio for an audience you don't have. You do radio for the audience you do have. And so that's how the prison show has evolved into what it is. It's not at all like I imagined it, putting it on the air. But I think it's probably a very significant use of the medium.
'Cause I'm back home in Huntsville again.
Good evening and welcome. Voted the best radio talk show in 2006 and entering its 27th year on the air, KPFT Houston is proud to present The Prison Show. Join Ray Hill and the whole Prison Show gang as they enter the studio to discuss cops in courts, jails and prisons, probation and parole, and then open the microphones and allow you to listen in on the wonderful voices of people who care about people in prison. You may even gain a whole new perspective. Join us now for The Prison Show.
Lo and behold, it's time to holler down that pipe chase and rattle them bars, because we can do a prison show for you right here on beautiful old, historic old, exciting new KPFT Houston. Now that's the Nada .1 FM frequency voice of Pacifica Foundation in the upper Texas Gulf Coast. However, we try to do it at 89.5 on the balmy Isle of Galveston. Glad to have you Galvestonians out there listening up. Good to have you folks out there all together. This is a convict place we got here, and we got some interesting things to talk to you about. Those of you who are planning on getting out in life being simple and uncomplicated, and parole officers looking after your best interests and helping you find jobs and helping you find a place to stay and making sure that you get home to visit your mama and all kinds of wonderful things. You're in for a surprise, and we're going to be talking about that today. A couple of things. We're going to start tonight on the Prison Show, 100 words or less, an essay contest. All right, now all you guys listen up. Now these are instructions for the essay. Use your imagination. Just throw yourself into this and play like you're writing it for Doc Kendall. You're going to write it for me, and we're going to form a panel here to read your essays. Essay contest. Why Paris Hilton should be my cellie. All right, you got that?
Holy smoly.
This is an essay contest. Listeners to the Prison Show in prisons within KPFT's broadcast range may submit essays of 100 words or less explaining why putting Paris Hilton into your cell would be good for you, good for Paris Hilton, good for the cause of justice, and good for the world. The winning essay will be read on a future The Prison Show, and you will receive other means of recognition, not to include anything about smuggling contraband. What is it, Dewey?
Yeah, I just want them to bear in mind that there are words that they cannot use on the air.
Yeah, there are 7 words that cannot be said on broadcast, and if you really think about it, you can think of at least 50.
But Paris Hilton, not two. Those aren't two of those
Paris
words.
Hilton,
Yeah.
you still use
Not
those
yet.
words. You may not be able to do that by the time we get these essays.
Well, now but she's doing pretty good. She finally went home with a monitor on her leg. They let her out a little
and
early.
they put her right back today.
They put her back today?
Yeah, you're not.
I'm not up on
God.
anything, my
Dan,
God.
Dan has
But
lost
see-
his
but
place
see,
in the
I
hymnal.
But I love Paris because she made one statement one time that will endear her for years and years. Do you know what it was? She says, people who say money can't buy everything simply don't know where to shop.
But Paris Hilton is back in jail. She's going to do her time. And this is, write me an essay like you're talking to the building major and saying why Paris Hilton should be your cellie. And guys, get creative. I would include the gals, but there are no women's prisons with radios in the broadcast range of KPFT in Houston. They can, but they don't let them have radios because it's a state jail and they ain't got no plugs.
Gotcha.
Right. And Peter writes me from the Wallace Pack. Peter's got a 5-2 number, a 5-1 number, and he writes me back, and Peter, see, you get smart, just listen to the Prison Show. First he gets mad because I'm talking about changing, and he's a career criminal and all that. And now he is mad about how the system's treating him, that he decided he's going to change. Well, congratulations, you finally figured it out. I beat you by, how long have I been out, Bill?
30 years?
32 years. I've been out 32 years. I figured this out 32 years ago and ain't been back. And I wish you well. Congratulations. Don writes me from the WIN unit. And thank you very much for the Veterans Memorial Day program from the WIN unit. And John Larrabee sent me the same thing from the Ramsey unit. You veterans apparently had a good holiday. Don has got a 53 number, and John has got a 42 number, so these ain't drive-ups. Don, I am concerned about your diabetes. I went to see my diabetes doctor today. Insulin is working to me, and Don writes me about some very serious medical problems up on the WIN unit, and I got some other letters about health crisis on the WIN unit and in the Huntsville unit, and I am very concerned about the health problems. Here's a little something to remember. If you have a medical crisis and the guards do not respond, it is the responsibility of the attending physician on your unit. It's not the major's fault. It's not the captain's fault. It's not even the mulligan's fault. If it is a health crisis and you can't get health care, it is the doctor's fault. And let me tell you something else. Dr. July and all of the other doctors in UTMB, medical services, in TDC, healthcare business, have liability insurance provided to them by the University of Texas Medical Branch. If you lose a leg unnecessarily, and I've got one of those in the stack today, or if you are placed in unnecessary jeopardy, or you're not provided adequate medications to treat your diabetes, then the doctor, not TDC, is responsible. The doctor has the responsibility of that, and the doctor has liability insurance. that you and or your lawyer need to get to know about. Okay? Just make a point of that and think about it. It's not the Mulligan's fault you can't get to the doctor. It's the doctor's fault you can't get to the doctor. And from the Stringfellow unit, Brian, who lost a leg and has picked up several cases because they don't give him enough time to shower. Now, I'm a peg-legged guy. I've got one leg, and I have to sit down in my shower and take a shower with one leg. I know what that's like. And Don, I got a lot of sympathy, or Brian, I got a lot of sympathy for your problem. However, Brian I got a 140 number. That means he just basically drove up. And apparently he sustained these injuries that cost him a leg somewhere way over in Georgia or some other place, and he has carried that with him in Texas prison. And because of your problem with the shower on the Stringfellow unit, that too is the doctor problem. Now, the Stringfellow unit is supposed to have a disability coordinator. All Texas prisons are supposed to have disability coordinators. That is a requirement to receive American Correctional Association accreditation, and it is a requirement under the Disabilities Act. All units of incarceration have a disabilities coordinator that you're supposed to be able to go talk to about the problems you have dealing with your disability in that environment. If they do not have one, they're in violation of the American Association or American Correctional Association accreditation process. And if they do not have one, they're in violation of the American for Disability Act. So, next have, Brian doesn't write too good, so he has a friend write for him. Write me back and explore who is the disability coordinator on the Stringfellow unit. I need that person's name. Send it to me. If they claim they do not have one, send me a letter with the warden's name so that I can report they're not meeting the compliance of the American Correctional Association's accreditation thing, and I can turn them over to the members of House of Representatives from my district and neighboring districts to deal with that reality on your behalf in the federal government. David Heyer, I usually don't do last names, but David, Barbara calls me at home this evening, and she asked me to carry her message, which was, hello, she's fine, and I don't normally do that. But seeing as how she's had the wreck, and I got the letter from you explaining all of that, I did hear from her this evening. She was going to call back about a half hour before the show and catch Ann. Did she catch you, Ann? Okay, she caught Ann, so Ann's got more details on that, so there's no sense in me milking that duck. Dan,
Ray,
what you got?
Well, one thing I just want to touch on, do you know that the ACA accreditation, do you know why they started that? A lot of people don't really know. Back in December, January of 1980 and 81, Bill was in Austin. He had an office in Austin then, and he handed me, he said, do you want a copy of this? I said, what is it? He says, it's the latest thing. It's the Ruiz case. It just came off. I said, yeah. And so I made copies and took it to ACA and to the Texas Observer and to Cure. Anyway, so from that point on, TDC they were under those court orders. Every 2 years they'd go to legislature, we need money. We need money. We've got to comply with this judge. We have to comply with Ruiz. We have to comply with Ruiz. Well, finally, Ruiz was dissipated thanks to two real intelligent, one senator and a representative, who cost the state more money in relitigating those issues than anybody knows. But, so all of a sudden, TDC doesn't have Ruiz. You know, it's not there anymore. That deep pocket has got a hole in it. So we've got to do something. I don't know who thought of this. I imagine it was somebody in their, who takes care of their finances? The board?
Lenow used to take care of it.
Well, Lenow did for a long time. Well, it may have been Lenow,
and
but
all
no,
you
Lenow's
had to do is go down by Lenow another bottle, and you could make the numbers up.
So they had to do. So in order to go to the legislature with their budget, which is a pretty big chunk, you know, several $1 billion every 2 years, They say we have to comply with the ACA, which is a creature.
We need
Okay,
to
well,
be
let me tell you,
Exactly.
I've actually been to ACA conferences. I carried
You were there with Doug, weren't
I
you?
carried a video camera up there, and me and Doug Dredke did a little duet in front of the camera. It
Doug's
was,
a good
really
man, I'll tell you
and
that.
all that. But let me tell you something about the ACA. It is a self-inspecting program. In other words, TDC units fill out the papers to tell the ACA they qualify, unless there is counter information with stroke. If the check don't bounce, you're accredited.
I know, I've been a member.
Yeah,
I've been a member. I know that.
I don't care what it is.
Yeah.
I had one guy who used to be the medical director of the ACA. He had been the medical director for the Montana prison system. He was a gay guy, wore little pink triangles and little lambdas on his smock when he saw convict patients. He was the Republican governor, and the Republican director of prison knew he was gay, and he was a good one. And ACA said, this guy's good. We can take him to Maryland, to their offices, and they're going to make him the head of the medical division ACA. So he went over there, and he got the job, and the first medical division that came in an application, he looked it over and he denied him. You got to do this and this and this and this and this. And so the application went back, and then it came back a few months later, and he denied him again. And his boss come in and said, no, you don't understand that how it works around here. If the check doesn't bounce, we accredit them. So
And that's the way it
then
works.
That's the way the ACA works.
That doesn't
But-
surprise me.
No.
But if you go in there with counter information, especially if it deals with the American for Disability Act, then you can get a little action.
They'll perk up.
You get a little action.
Let me
Okay.
get in. I've
Okay.
got several letters, and I'm going to answer all of them, Billy Allen. But I've got a special letter here from James Edward Hogan. That's on my old partner I worked with on the eldest unit long, long time ago. I'd forgotten all about you, bro. He said, you remember when we worked in the kitchen together, and you remember on H-Town in 71 when you got me bench warranted back to Dallas? Yeah, I do. You and Cheney and some others. I remember all those writs. But I'm going to see what I can do. I don't know if I can do anything to help you. But after 25 years, bro, and I know you haven't got a violent crime, you got a robbery, but you don't have any violence in it, nobody was hurt. So I'm going to see if I can find somebody that might be able to do you something on those 2-year set-offs you've been getting for the last 12, 15 years. And I still love you, and I still think of you, man, all of you down there. That's about it, right?
Okay, well, we got special guests in the house, and the reason we got special guests in the house is we got a parole situation here, and it has to do with wetting the bottom of the cup. And this fella was on KPFT earlier today. He was on one of Dean Becker's show, and Dean's been running you all week.
Yes, sir. I was on Monday. I was on Monday night. No, I was on Monday, the 420 Drug Network, Monday, and like Paul Harvey says, the rest of the story on Tuesday. And Lisa Falkenberg ran the story Friday, June 1st, a week ago.
And Lisa's writing for?
The Houston Chronicle,
Houston
excuse me.
Chronicle.
Yes, sir. City and State.
Okay,
Front
now
page.
what's the issue?
Well-
Number one, introduce yourself.
My name is Richard Traylor.
Richard Traylor, and
Thank you,
you're
Ray.
on parole?
Yes, sir. I've been out for 5 years.
And you've listened to Prison Show before?
Oh, yes. I listened to it when I was locked up.
You listened to it when you're locked up, and you and I have run into each other at PAC conferences and other things.
Right. Last time I saw you
Snooping
was at Al Franken's gig.
When they gave me the prize,
Right,
yeah.
December 2nd.
Last year, year before last.
Before
yeah.
last, I believe.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm here because I want to recommend to potential parolees. And you know, I heard this the whole time I was locked up from guys that have been in and out of prison. The thing then was to tell the parole officer or the official that was going to grant them parole to stick it in their neck.
Close to the microphone.
To stick the parole in their neck. And I thought that was just crazy
That
because
sounds like Harvey Stewart.
yeah, but now I realize what it is. I thought it'd be easier to do your time out on the street than in there. It just didn't make any sense to me. But now I see what they're talking about. What they were saying was they're gonna jack with you once you get out on parole. I thought it'd be easy. I don't do drugs. I don't drink. I'm domesticated. I'm married. Been married forever.
Has a good job.
Has a great job. Very understanding boss. I've been doing the same thing since '89. So I thought it didn't make any sense, but now I see what they're talking about.
Tell them what happened.
April 19th, my parole officer called me, asked me what kind of medication, if I'm on any kind of medication, and I told him, yeah, I'm on allergy medicine. And he said, I said, why? He said, because you came up dirty for cocaine. After getting over trying to swallow my tongue, I told him that's impossible. I wanted to talk to his supervisor. Got nowhere with her. She said the only way that you came up positive is if you did the drug. And I begged to differ with her. I called my attorney, Ken McLean. He said, go get another test right now.
McLean's your attorney, right? That's pretty good.
And
choice.
Mr. Habern right here.
And Bill Habern, yeah, you don't play the lower end of the rack, I take it, right?
I've used just about every attorney in Houston.
I used to work in office with dude.
Well, he speaks very highly of you.
Yeah, well, I speak very highly of him.
Okay. Well, I could say a lot less about the rest of the attorneys I use. It seemed the hardest thing they did was deposit my check.
Okay, that happened, yeah.
But anyway, get back to the story. Kim McLean says, go get another independent test right now. And don't tell them, the parole, about getting the test. So I didn't. I called my doctor. He got me in the Trinity Hospital that night. I got the GCMS, the one lots better than the one that the parole office does.
Test.
Right, the one that's actually accepted in the court of law.
Sure.
The next day I went into parole, tried to talk to them. They wouldn't listen. And I asked them, aren't you going to take another test? Because that's what they had said the day before on the phone. They said, no, if it comes up positive again, it's going to complicate things. And that didn't make any sense, so I insisted they take another test. They took another test. They didn't have the results. They didn't give me the results until 5 or 6, 7 days later. So when I walked out of there, I went and got another independent test done immediately, within a few hours.
Right.
It came back negative also.
Your test?
Yes, sir. Both of them did, the one the night before and the one the few hours after theirs. I got theirs boxed in. I didn't tell them as in the parole office people, parole officers, that I had done 2 independent tests. In the meantime, I hired Habern, Buckley, and O'Neill. Excuse me, Habern, O'Neill, and Buckley.
Yeah.
And we talked about a hair follicle test. So we got the hair follicle test. The same day we got the hair follicle test, the parole office called and said that I came back positive again. Well, this is when we played our ace in the hole and said, well, we got you boxed in. We got 2 tests. We got one the night before and we got one a few hours later. Well, you could see the color draining out of their face. So we thought when we got the results back from the hair follicle test, it being negative also, that cooler heads would prevail, that their bosses would listen.
Let me step in here. I'd had a conversation with Brian Collier about this. We had a 2-week, the head of the parole division. The 2-week period, we had 4 people that just doesn't make sense they'd do drugs. They couldn't do the kind of drugs they were testing positive for and get up and go to work the next morning. Opiates. These guys have no drug history. And I got a little concerned about it. So I called Brian. I said, we've got you on the front end and the back end, and you're in the middle. And the only ones that come up adverse are the ones you give. The ones we give, I'm having him observed when he goes to the lab. We're watching the nanogram so we know the test is right. Stuff we can introduce. And he said, well, I'm so glad you had that hair test done because that's the most definite. And we had it done sufficiently after the time that it would show up in the hair. And he went on and on about the hair test. Then 3 weeks later, when I get the letter back, when he makes a decision about this, he says, I'm sorry, but we don't pay any attention here at TDCJ to hair test, which is the most reliable test of them all.
They pay attention if it's a positive, but they don't pay attention.
And the same thing happened to 3 other guys that had contacted me. So they're not going to admit that there's anything wrong with their test, but so far we've kept blue warrants from issuing on all of these things by doing what we're doing. There's something wrong with those tests, and what it is it's the way the sample's collected and what happens with the sample after that. It's not a very good test. It's probably the best they can afford, but we discovered that in our research. It has to do with the money end of it. But if it's a weekend, a 3-day weekend, you might give your sample on Thursday. Friday in Houston, it gets transferred to the central location at the parole office where they test this stuff. And so it gets over there on Friday. You got Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday they come back in. They may test it Wednesday. It's been sitting out in the hall with the air conditioner off. It's stale, and we're just having a load of these. So What we're here tonight to discuss and forewarn folks about is if you are in a position and you start having these kind of problems, they're not going to admit they're wrong. They're not going to reconsider it. What we have Richard doing now, and luckily he's a person that goes into refineries and inspects them and has a good job, but they'll make you go to drug class whether you're dirty or not. One client of mine was a sex offender up in Dallas, never had a drug problem in his life, tested dirty twice. I had him do the same thing. Private tests come back, he's fine, he's clean. So when he was having his quarterly polygraph, this is the sex offender polygraph, where the parole board goes and gets the polygrapher, and you polygraph, they ask him another question. The question was, have you used controlled substances in the last 90 days? He says no. He passes the polygraph. Then his parole supervisor says, well, we don't believe our own polygrapher.
Oh, my God.
So,
How convenient. How
So,
convenient.
so it's a stacked deck, in other words.
It's
What you're telling me,
absolutely
it's
a
an
stack.
absolutely stacked deck. Now, you said something a while back. I'm going to go back to that. You said a blue warrant has not issued in this case or in some of the other
in
cases.
the
where-
other four, by us having this backup done privately. I can't remember our office losing a parole revocation based on a dirty urine test. We may have, I don't remember it, because we can keep the evidence from coming in because they can't make the predicate to get the evidence in with parole officers collecting the specimens and not maintaining a chain of custody.
Oh, yeah. So there's a chain of custody
yeah,
problem. Yeah.
They
so-
throw the sample away immediately. They dispose of it as soon as they find it positive.
They dip their little stick in it.
If they do, well, some of them do stick tests and some of them don't. Do they do stick tests? I don't
The
know.
EMIT, I think that's the stick test
Yeah,
that you
I
buy at
believe it.
Walgreens, isn't it? I mean, you can do your own kid
Right.
with.
But what happens is this. What was the woman's name?
Get on the microphone.
Who was the woman's name that was the treasurer they called Granny that ran for governor? And
Ann Richard.
No.
No, this
Ann
last
Richard's the
election.
one.
You're talking about
Rylander.
Rylander.
was the middle name.
When she first went in office,
Strayhorn.
Strayhorn was
Yeah.
her, ended up with
Yeah,
as her
that's-
name. She first went in office. There was a quote in the Austin statement. She said, anything that we can find to farm out, that we can do less expensive, we're going to do. And if we have to go to Yellow Pages to find it, we will. And that's what happens. It's the bottom of the barrel. In other words, if your agency puts in whatever you do, if you put in the lowest bid, it's not like...
There's a reason why it's the cheapest.
Exactly. Yeah.
But in the long run, it's a heck of a lot
But
more
there's no
expensive.
quality control whatsoever.
When you're talking $30,000 to house an inmate, they're saving a nickel and spending $1,000.
But Bill said they're going to build 3 more prisons now.
No,
too.
they're not building 3 more. They were taking 3 offline.
Oh, offline. Because
And now
they couldn't
this
staff
old
them?
central unit and some other
Okay.
units, and now they figured out they're going to keep using those.
Can they staff them?
I think.
Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is that land where the central unit is gets
Yeah.
more and more expensive. We have
Oh,
busted
yeah, all
them
that
trying to
land.
sell that below market for a
15,
while.
20 years from now, that won't be a prison at all.
Oh, let me tell you, I mean, they were trying to sell the Central and Central and Ferguson are on the same reservation. They were trying to sell that reservation for $6,000 an acre, when right across the highway they were selling it for $60,000 a lot. And you get about 8 lots to the acre, so somebody was going to make a whole bunch of money there off the governor.
The thing that impresses me about Richard is that Richard had the fortitude to come forward. He is adamant about it. People don't spend money on lawyers who have gone out and done drugs and are contesting the issue. These are people that have been calling me, and it all happened within a 2-week period. But I have now discovered that all the weakness of this seems to stem from the collection and processing of the specimens. And that's where the problem is. And they're not going to admit it. They're not going to change. But I think if you protect yourself and are very careful and learn the steps that they're supposed to go through, you can probably keep
I got a completely stupid question here. Richard.
Yes, sir.
Please don't sir me. I'm just another old convict.
Okay.
Are you ready for the comeback? You ready for the retribution?
The repercussions? You know, this country and this, especially this state, was founded on people that took a stand. And the first thing that Mr. Hayburn warned me of was repercussions. Yeah, I'm ready.
I mean, you're out here. I mean, let me tell you, let's get the audience up to speed here. You're on parole.
Yes, sir. I got 2 years, 8 months, and 3 weeks left.
2 years, 8 months, and I never count. Do you count yours backward? No, you don't count. You got
Don't
it for
even
the-
count.
you-
Two life sentences.
Two life sentences.
I don't count.
Two depressing.
I just thank God every morning.
You will bingo before you count.
That's
right?
it.
Yeah. Dewey, did you count backwards?
No, I'm more like a TD Segura. I can't count.
Dewey can't count anyway.
But all right. So you're counting backwards so that you get to the end of it, and you know, it's not a surprise to you that in the prison system, TDCJ and TDCJ units like the parole division are really petty, small-minded, little mean people.
He's found that out if you didn't know it.
Yes, that's correct.
Not all of them. Not all of them.
Well, I'll let the defense speak
Not
here. But
all of them. I've had some parole officers that were angels. I've had three of them were angels.
Well, they didn't make it to director because let me tell you something. Let me tell you something about this Brian. Brian Collier has sat in the chair that you're sitting in here and lied through that microphone. I didn't call him on it. Nobody in the room called it. Chuck Hurt was in here buttering him, just licking his butt every minute that he moved. You'd think Chuck was in hog heaven. I'm sitting here listening, and Bracey Owens is sitting next to him, and she's lying in the studio. Now, I didn't call him on it because I knew every convict out there in prison that was listening to the show knew more about every lie that they told than I could ever point out on this show. And I got the next week I come in here and opened up a mail. I got 25 pounds of mail that week. Why the hell didn't you call them on it? I don't do the gotcha show. I don't need to because I've got an audience that can sort it out. Now, I've got an audience listening to you.
Okay.
And they're sitting out there, they're saying, would I have the courage to jeopardize my freedom in front of those small-minded, petty bastards to do what you're doing?
Thank you. I understand that, and I didn't even think about it. It's just the right thing to do. There's a very dear friend of mine who I called just the other day, and he told me this, and I'm going to quote it again because I quoted it on the first show. Lies are like mold. They grow when there's no light shined on it. We're shining the light on it right now.
Okay, well, let me give you a line to use. When a cop walks up to me and says, Mr. Hill, we're going to have to lock you, put you in handcuffs, put you in jail, I say, son, I've been sentenced to 160 years in the Texas penitentiary. And if you think I'm afraid to go to your chicken stuffed jail, you're just out of your mind. If all I needed to do is 2 or 3 years to discharge, I can do that standing on my head in dog doo-doo. All right? And I'm not afraid to go to jail. I got friends there.
Another thing about these 4 cases is that Richard is the one who has chosen to make this an issue. Some of the other folks don't even want their name mentioned for reasons everyone in this room can well understand. However, the thing about it is that he knew, I gave him some examples of what had happened to even people who I've represented that we won civil rights cases from in the way of retaliation. I don't think that he lives up in the Huntsville area. And I think that the worst is over for this. But look what it's cost him. They won't revoke him. They won't issue a blue warrant. But they will not give him travel permits to go out of state anymore. So he's lost half of his income where he used to be able to go into these out-of-state refineries. They're making him go to a drug school that he doesn't need. They won't recognize the most scientific test of all, and they mislead you about the contents of what they think of their tests. They know those tests come out false positive. Every test has false positive. But they're not going to admit it. So you got to protect yourself, and you got to stand up.
What do you reckon we're paying? The taxpayers are paying Brian Collier?
I don't know what he makes.
$150,000
between $80,000 and $100,000 a year.
Between $80,000 and $100,000 for a director of a division of the criminal justice system. I don't know why we're paying that sucker anything at all. It looks to me like Andy Kahn is running his whole business. It looks to me like before Brian Collier could make a decision, he's got to pick up the telephone and call Andy Kahn and say, what are you going to do about this? And let me tell you, Andy Kahn's fixing to get into chips. You know that gal Raven, the victims' rights gal for the TDCJ? You know, whenever they put in these telephones, she's going to get control of half of that profit.
That's substantial.
It's going to go through her office. And she's already promised Andy Kahn in Houston, Texas, consulting fees of a considerable amount. So every time a convict calls his mama or his wife collect on the telephone system, now don't get me wrong, I'm all in favor of the telephones. But every time you do that, half of the profit off of that call is going to go into a system to try to prevent you making parole, to try to put all kinds of restrictions on your parole, and to do a lobbying effort to increase the term of sentences, and to restrict you, and to put some people under civil commitment. And that's what's going to happen to the telephone. Congratulations, we got the telephone bill, but there is something that you need to do about that right now. You need to talk to the people in the free world, and they need to call the senator and say, look, I'm trying to get my husband out. Why does half of the profit on every phone call he is making to my house going to go to fight his effort to make parole?
It's a racket.
And who is Andy Kahn?
Andy Kahn is the guy that got fired from the parole division for falsifying his expense account. I mean, this man got busted stealing chump change.
But he was Pam Lynch's friend. You forget that.
Well, Pam Lyncher was fine. I didn't have a problem with Pam Lyncher. She was just his.
That's what he uses.
Yeah,
But
he
what
had his hand up her butt, moving her mouth. Is what he was doing.
What does he know about consulting in phone business?
He is. I mean, listen. This guy knows something. He sexually assaulted that woman in Austin, and he got Ted Poe and Mike McSpadden and Johnny Holmes to run over there and convince Ronnie Earl not to proceed with those charges. You remember when all that happened?
I remember that clearly. I remember that.
And now he should be a registered sex offender. All right? But because he's privileged and he's got powerful friends, he's not. Let me tell you, you talk about what this country is about. This country is not about that kind of privilege.
Theoretically speaking, it's not, but we all know a little bit different.
Well, I mean, we'll have to ask Paris Hilton about that.
My point exactly.
In the criminal justice system, money does not talk, she screams. Yeah, well, I'm holed up here because they're cooking hamburgers and they don't have any radio. You got a second? Sure, I'll take a moment. This is a story from Ray Hill, The Prison Years, where I recount my experiences in Texas prisons. And it's about a really tragic scene that I witnessed. And it takes a few minutes, so I hope you got patience. Dan they called him Raper Dan, because that's what he did. He was a rapist. He would go to prison for being a rapist, and then you'd read in the newspapers that he had raped somebody in jail awaiting trial for being a rapist, and then he got to prison, and then he raped people there, and he was just like a real bad guy about rape. As a matter of fact, the last time he was arrested, which is after I got out of prison and well after this story, is Elma Barrera went over to Channel 13 to cover his arrest, or his arrest earlier that day, and there was some children playing out by the street, and she asked the children, what happened here today? And they said, oh, they came and arrested that big fat raper man back there. So even the kids in the neighborhoods where he lived knew he was a rapist. I mean, this was not the best kept secret in the world. And well, Dan went to Texas prison, and he worked in the line, and the line are the people that pick the cotton or the soybeans, the cash crops. And there was a tall, transgendered black person there that everybody called Dolores, and Dolores was also from 3rd Ward, but she didn't know Dan from 3rd Ward, but she was in prison at the same time he was. And Dolores worked in the garden squad, which meant she would go out later in the day and after breakfast and picked vegetables and like the corn and the peas and the beans that we all ate and the greens. And so she lived in the punk wing and worked in the garden squad, and Dan lived in the line wing and worked in the line. So their lives, although you're in a compact area, would never encounter one another unless they went to school and church, and neither one of them were motivated to do that. And so they stayed pretty much separate lives. But word had it that Dan was interested in an opportunity to get to know Dolores better. And so I'm working as a bookkeeper in the maintenance department, and I get a call from the building bookkeeper, the major's bookkeeper, and he said, I said, Ray, well, they call one another last name. They call me Mickey because I wore a Mickey Mouse watch. Said, Mickey, old Slim's bringing in the line. And I looked outside, and it was clear sunshine, and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the line would go out before dark, I mean after daylight, and come back just before dark. And that was unusual. And I said, well, maybe he's got a dental appointment. No, I checked everything. You don't have an appointment. I said, well, what's the word? Well, the word is that he's going to give Dan his chance. Well, that's all he said, but I knew, and anyone else who heard that would know what that meant. And so we began to gather up around the back gate where the line and the garden squad would be coming in about 4 o'clock. And sure enough, about 4 o'clock, they formed up to come through shakedown. Now, the way that worked is after working in the fields all day, you come into prison buck naked. You take all your clothes off, and your boots and your socks and your underwear and your cap going one hand and your boots going the other, and you wait your turn to get shaken down by the officer, and you come up there and you hit the heel of your boot together and shake it out, set that down, shake your underwear and socks so you can obviously have nothing in it, put that down, then you turn around and spread your cheeks and crack a big smile at the officer, and then you head for the showers. Now, there were 10 lines of people doing that. In one of those lines were Dan, and then over to the side there were 4 lines of people coming in from the garden squad, and in one of those lines was Dolores. And Dolores was standing there very discreetly. We were all there. I took a position on top of the power station there, where the boiler room was, so that I could get a good bird's eye view, and officers and majors and all of these people came from everywhere to eyeball what was going on, and so they showed up to see all of this. Everybody knew what was going on except Dolores. And there she was, standing very erect with her boots discreetly covering her private parts and shifting her weight from one side to the other, and kind of showed everybody what Dan was interested in, and that was the featured side, I suppose you can say. And Dan was very erect too, except his knuckles were dragging the ground, and erect probably meant ready more than erect in the sense of order. And he was looking through the crowd, and all of a sudden he came chunking convicts out of the way with both hands, knocking them out of the way, and headed beeline for Dolores. And Dolores heard the commotion and turned around and looked, but it was too late. He was on her, and he grabbed her and wham, bam, and they fell and hit the ground. And Slim, who had rode his horse over here just outside the fence on Dolores' side to watch the whole thing, let it go on for a few minutes and then told the officers to break it up. And they went over and broke it up. And Dan had shit and blood from his navel to his knees, and Dolores had the same thing down the back. And they just took them right over, both of them, and put them in solitary confinement, which was a building right next to the back gate, and it was a 3 by 3 foot squares. You backed the convicts in because you put a metal plate over the door, and they had to breathe through little holes cut in that metal plate. And they left Dan in there for, it couldn't be called rape, because if it was a rape charge, you had to go outside to a free world court and try it. So they called it fighting without a weapon. And Dan spent a month in solitary, and Dolores spent 6 weeks in solitary, because in Texas prisons in the 1970s, you were punished more severely for being a victim of rape than you were for being a rapist. Now, the real moral of that story is not the horror that I witnessed, because I did witness the horror. The real horror of that story is what it had done to me, what prison was doing to me, because I had placed several bets in several locations that he would have meat in her before they hit the ground, and that was a good bet. And so I left that scene going back to the maintenance office, trying to figure out how much money I was going to collect from the bets that I had made.
How did you start being an evangelist?
Well, Frankie had promised her mother, Mary. Now remember, Frankie's father was an atheist, but Frankie's mother was not. She was a church-going Baptist believer, and Frankie's mother, before she died, made Frankie promise her that she would raise her children in church. And Frankie always kept her promises to her mother. So, raised in church. Frankie went to church every Sunday of my life. Now, after I was 10, 11 years old, I didn't have to go. Before that, I had to go. But as I got older, I had more independence. But since Frankie was going, that just became the Sunday morning routine. And then I turned 13 on October the 13th, 1953. And the following Sunday, I came bounding into the kitchen, ready to go to church, and there stood Frankie with the oven door propped open, her foot on it. She liked to stay close to the oven in cool weather, drinking a cup of coffee and smoking a cigarette in a shiver robe. And I said, Frankie, aren't you going to church? I was shocked. She said, no. Matter of fact, I promised my mother I would raise my children in church. I did that. You're my last child. You're no longer a child. You're a teenager. You can go to church if you want to, but I'm never darkening the door of one of those dens of hypocrisy as long as I live. And she didn't. We had Frankie's funeral in Bale Park on Montrose because she just didn't want to go to church. She went to church with me a few times when I started preaching. So whenever Frankie wasn't there, I got a little carried away with the church thing. Now I had to keep on going to church because all of my friends went to church. My social life was in church. My sex life was in church. I had learned by the time I was 13 years old that all you've got to do is look a little vulnerable and the youth minister is all over you. And if it wasn't him, it's the music minister. And my wife doesn't understand me. Let's go over here and do this. And you mustn't tell anybody. And I was enjoying the free sex and guilt-ridden church-going child molesters are so covered up with guilt, it was hot, male, sweaty sex. And I was enjoying that. That was kind of fun. And so I wasn't going to stop doing that, so I had to keep on going to church, and I did. So without Frankie there, I not only went to church, but I began getting interested in what's going on there and teaching my Sunday school class, and that came to the attention of the preacher. And I started memorizing, and I memorized the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, you would think that was difficult to do, but it's not. It's only one story. All 3 Gospels are written about the life of Christ. So it's relatively easy to remember. All you've got to remember is the difference between the various Gospels. Luke is a little different from Matthew and Mark and John, which is basically the same material told in slightly different ways. So I got into memorizing the Gospels and enjoy that, doing that. And the preacher started sitting in on my teaching Sunday school class for people my age. And he was kind of interested in that. And then he asked me if I would teach the adult Sunday school class. And I said, okay. And so I did that a couple of times. And then he asked me if I would do the Wednesday night service, which in Baptist church, one Wednesday night a month is a business meeting for the congregation. And 3 Wednesday nights a month are Bible study. And I said, well, where are you in the Bible study? And he said, Matthew 19th chapter. Now, that's an interesting part of the Bible. It's pretty heavy stuff. Matthew 9, it deals with divorce. It deals with celibacy, which I would say was gay stuff. It's pretty ticklish and adult material. So I said all of the 19th chapter because it's long, and he said the first half of it. So I'm 19th chapter of Matthew up to about the 30th verse. Well, I remember that well. And it starts out in Matthew, the Pharisees, now that's the bad guys, if you don't know. Pharisees, they're the people who pray loudly in public and maybe too much, and so they're automatically suspect. If you study the Pharisees, you get the impression that people who go to church a lot have much to be forgiven for. And so the Pharisees have come to Jesus and they're going to trap him. It's an entrapment deal. They say, Rabbi, that's what they called him, which means basically teacher, said, Rabbi, what about divorce? And Jesus reads divorce to quail shit. I mean, Jesus goes beyond the law, basically says that if you have a covenant with a woman and if you ever break it, or even if she dies and you take up with another woman, you are committing adultery, and you would have been just, I mean, it was really scary the way Jesus condemns divorce. And that makes the Pharisees uncomfortable. They're the keepers of the law, and all of a sudden, this is beyond what they thought was kosher. So they said, gosh, then, is it better not to marry? In the 10th verse of Matthew 19, Jesus says, this message is not for everybody, but let those who hear it receive it. It's the only time in his gospel he said, I'm not talking to a general audience. In this one, is verses 10 through 12, 19th chapter of Matthew. Jesus says, this ain't for everybody, this is for a few, but let them that hear it receive it. And he says, there are eunuchs who are eunuchs from their mother's womb. Whoa, wait a minute. I thought eunuch was a castrati. Well, prenatal castration is not, even today, a very sophisticated or usual medical procedure. I mean, so some people are born eunuchs. Is that what you're saying? He said there were eunuchs who are eunuchs from their mother's womb. And there are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men. And there are eunuchs who choose to be eunuchs for the glory of the kingdom. And then he wraps it up with saying, now that's not for everybody, but for those to whom it applies, let them receive it. Well, when you're 13 years old and you've memorized that, and you're gay, and you have to wrestle with what is he talking about there, it is obviously true that he is not talking about castrated guys. which at age 13, I thought that's what eunuch meant. But it doesn't sound right in that context. What he's talking about is talking about men who don't marry and men who don't have children. And some people are destined for that from their mother's wombs. Some folks are made eunuchs by men, and some folks choose to be eunuchs. Well, mercy, that's the nature-nurture argument about being gay. But at any rate, I put that in some kind of context, and I did Bible study that night. What I didn't know is that Pastor Martin, who was our pastor, had invited some other Baptist preachers from Pasadena who were sitting in the back of the church hearing me talk about that. And after that service, I don't even remember everything that I said about it. I certainly didn't suggest that eunuchs were gay people then, but I believed it then. After that was over, the pastors from Pasadena came up and said, young man, have you been called to preach? I didn't know what they were talking about. What is called to preach? And they thought that I made a good presentation. They thought that I spoke well. They thought that I had an understanding of difficult scripture. And they were convinced that I was called to preach. It didn't make any difference what I thought. We were headed somewhere with this. And so they wanted to know if they could set it up and have me travel as an evangelist, a teenage evangelist. I'm 13 years old. And I said, no, I couldn't think about doing that without my parents' permission. So they get together to go talk to Frankie. Now, understand, Frankie is a non-believer, a skeptic. She's an atheist. And here come these preachers saying, ma'am, can we have your son? And she's not too sure about that. So she asked me, do you want to do this? And I said, well, Frankie, they said that I was going to make some money and that I can try it. And so I became a teenage evangelist. Of course, first we started in Pasadena and South Houston, and wherever there were missionary and independent Baptist churches. Now, you need to understand that not all Baptist churches are the same. There's the Southern Baptist Convention, which are now considered the conservative Baptist church. And then there's missionary and independent Baptist, which are the more hard shell Baptist church. An independent church, the preacher owns the building and puts the collection in his pocket. And if anybody asks him how much that was, that's suddenly a big church-state issue. Missionary Baptist church have some kind of loose organization. And so I started preaching, call it youth revivals. They would bring in other young kids of the church, and I would preach, and that would encourage them to follow the role model and become more faithful. So I was a youth evangelist. And as I got more and more sophisticated, I was given more and more responsibility with preaching to adults and all of that. By the time I was 16 years old, this would be basically 1957, I made $70,000 that year as a teenage evangelist. Attending school full-time, preaching weekends, and during the summer, preaching every weekend. And usually a revival in the summertime meant that I would come into a town, and I worked up, I call it the Highway 59 circuit because it was East Texas. I'd come into town on Wednesday, hold a news conference, put out my glossies to the local paper, preach Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday we'd have dinner on the grounds and Bible study, and all the kids from the congregation, and surprising, would gather up into age groups and be studying Sunday school lessons, and I would go around and sit down with each group, figure out where they were, and suggest from memory other scriptures in the New or the Old Testament that they should read that worked in nicely with what they were studying. And I did all this from memory, so this was really an impressive show. So, I did that, and $70,000 incidentally in 1957 is like over $500,000 now. It was an enormous amount of money at 15 years old. I had my own Studebaker. I come and go as I went. I had more than enough money to buy my liquor and knowledge of where to do that so that I could go to that trailer house and get drunk on a regular basis. That was just the way I lived. And so I did that until Colemanile, Texas. Now, Colemanile, Texas is a little bitty crossroads between Woodville and Lufkin. Not much there. At the time I went to Colemanile, there was a Baptist church, an Oddfellows Lodge, and a Texaco service station on 3 corners of an intersection, and the 4th corner was farm, vacant. So I went to Colemanile, and I remember telling Frankie that I'm going to be out of high school next year. My career is expanding. I'm going to stop preaching in smaller churches, and Colemanile was one of the last smaller churches where I preached. I went up Colemanile Wednesday night, went through the usual routine. We had newspapers there from Lufkin and from Woodville. And so we had a good, successful news conference. They asked me questions, and, wrote articles, and took my pictures, and then they took some pictures of me themselves. And so we got out the media, and those papers would be coming out Friday. I preached Wednesday night, but since I'd been in the area before, there was a following that I had developed as an evangelist, and there were people from surrounding towns there on Wednesday night. Thursday night, the church was full. Friday night, we had to go rent some folding chairs because the pews wouldn't hold the crowd. And so here I was Friday night, fixing to preach, and as I approached the church, I went up there, and as I that night, cold front, we called it a squall line in those days, came through, and there was a lot of rain and thunder and lightning. And so I went to have dinner with one of the deacons and his family, and the pastor called and said, because of the weather and the crowd, he said, the church is filling up. Why don't you not come for the preliminary part of the service? We'd already decided what hymns they were going to sing and what scriptures were going to be read. So he said, why don't you wait until the last hymn and come in during that? The church is just packed. And I said, okay. And I was going to preach that night the Lutheran plan of salvation as opposed to the Baptist plan. The Baptist plan is John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish but have life everlasting. That's standard Baptist stuff. Well, that night I was going to do some Lutheran stuff. For by grace are ye saved, not through works, lest anyone should boast. Now, if you're familiar with the King James Version, I just cleaned up a very sexist, any man should boast scripture with that anyone should boast. And I was doing that then because I noticed that most of the people in my audience were women. And why do you preach to an audience you don't have? so anyone should boast would cover the women thing. And so that was pretty revolutionary stuff for the 50s, actually. And so I was going to do the Lutheran plan, and so I came, and it was raining out there and lightning, and I came down the center aisle while they were singing the hymn to the warm welcome of the congregation, bounded up on the rise there, the dais, and got behind the pulpit and began to preach. I made a joke. I said, you're lucky you got in here before this storm started, because the wind out there was about to blow me back to Houston. It was strong, and lightning was striking, and so they had read the scripture from Ephesians, from which the Lutheran plan comes. That's Paul's letter to Ephesus, to the church at Ephesus, and so it's titled Ephesians. And so I was fixing to preach about that, but I had spent a good bit of time reading the whole chapter so that I could preach that message in context. For by grace are you saved, not through works, lest anyone should boast. And if you read the whole picture, there is a hint of predestining. I mean, these are Germans, Lutherans actually. And they think they're better than everybody else anyway. And so even before you become saved in the Christian sense, you were called to salvation by God. That's the theory. And that predestiny is kind of new stuff for Baptists, and so I'm trying to get that concept to an audience that that's not, probably hasn't given that a lot of thought. So I'm already, but I've got notes because I'm off of I'm not in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's not a scripture that I memorized. I'm in Ephesians. So I have notes. Well, lightning strikes the transformer of the light pole outside, and the place goes dark. I mean, completely dark. The only thing you can see is little flashes of light. Here's my sister again, I think. See, driving like a bat out of hell.
Hey, see a place to stop to use the
We're fixing to stop. What you need?
If you see a place to stop to go to the restroom.
Okay, I'll stop soon. Yeah. Okay.
That is so cool. Your sister is so cool.
I know it. She's gonna, if she can find her way clear, she'll write. But let me go back to the church, because we're gonna have to edit all this sister stuff out. So I go in there to preach, and the lights go out, and I can't see my notes. They scramble around there, and I found a couple of kerosene lanterns and put on either side of the pulpit so that the audience can see me, but the light dissipates. I can't see them. There's not enough light there for that whole room just to light me. And so I'm sitting there trying to preach, and it's useless. I can't see my notes. I don't know where I'm going with this sermon that I'm not familiar with. I'm going to have to abandon the Lutheran idea, and I'm going to have to take up a new plan. So the new plan I decided to take up is just make a metaphor out of this experience, from the light into the darkness and back to the light, because I know the lights are coming on. Jesus didn't tell me that, but I had passed the East Texas utility truck in the parking lot on my way into the church. And I knew that whatever we were doing in there, that man was outside trying to figure out how to get the lights back on. And I just had faith, not in the Lord, but in him. So I'm sitting here in my mind, and I'm talking about the backslider things. And I'm drawing on my memory of Paul's letter to the church at Ephesus. And there's a lot in there about light and darkness and the light of the world, being Jesus Christ, is a metaphor, and all of this, and it's this rich material for this metaphor that I'm doing. This metaphor on the backsliders. You were born into the light when you were saved, and you've fallen into darkness. Now come back to the light, and the Lord welcomes you into the light. Come to the light. Come to the light. Come to the Lord. And I'm getting carried away with it, and I'm excited about it because it's working, and I can feel it working with the audience. Now, I hear some movement around out there, but I don't put a lot of worry in that because this is a Baptist church. You know, if the ladies don't like what you're saying, they'll actually pinch the babies and cause them to squall to interrupt your preaching. So I just go on with what I've got to do, and ultimately the lights came back on. A good homily is about 20 minutes long, but I was about 35 minutes into this. And when the lights came back on, the place was a mess. I mean a mess. It was all messed up. There were, the pews were rearranged. There were Baptists laying on the floor, fanning themselves like Pentecostals. And it was a mess. I had never seen anything like that in my life. And I looked around the church, and I didn't know what was going on. And there was a wheelchair, empty wheelchair, right there in front of the podium. When I started preaching, Miss Carly, a lady I had met when I first got there Wednesday, was in that wheelchair. She used to play the piano for the church. And she was all crippled up with rheumatoid arthritis. I mean, the kind of where your fingers are bent off at an angle, and big barnacle-like things at her knuckles. I mean, she didn't have any joints she could use, and they had to feed her and wheel her in a wheelchair. And she had been the pianist for the church many years ago, but she hadn't been out of that wheelchair in 20 years. And she had shaken my hand and glad to see me. And she was out of the wheelchair, and she was dancing around on her feet. And they helped her to the piano, and she sat down and played Amazing Grace. And there was a guy that I met that had a goiter down on his chest, and it was gone. He had a neck. And there are people there that had thrown away walking sticks and felt that they were cured in that sermon. And that scared me to death. Breaking point.
Okay. You want to pick this up?
Go pick it up.
Okay.
You got to go pee.
I'm out of tape. We're gonna eat. We're gonna eat.
Not here.
Okay. Let me change tape then, and then we can pick it right back up.
If you don't mind, I can eat what is this, Subway?
No,
But I'd much rather go to that Chinese buffet.
Let's do that.
This is the screenplay.
This woman was dancing.
She was out of the wheelchair. She was dancing in the back of the church. Now, things were really messed up. I mean, there were women laying on the floor, fanning their skirts like Pentecostals. This is the Baptist church, all right? This thing doesn't happen in Baptist churches. And the whole room was in chaos. The chairs had been folded. Chairs were folded up and on the floor, and the pews were askew, and there was all this motion activity going on, and it was real strange to me. And nothing like this had ever happened in my career. Now, I've been to Pentecostal revivals, and I'd seen people speaking in tongues, and people claimed to be cured and all that. I was very skeptical of it. I thought all that was basically phony. But this is in a revival where I'm conducting the service. This is a revival where I'm preaching. This is my congregation in response to my words, albeit under emotional circumstances with the lights and things. And I'll admit that my sermon was a very current and real metaphor, and it had some aspects to it that was pretty compelling. But I wasn't ready for this. Baptists don't put a lot of faith in faith healing. We never met a faith healer in our life that didn't wear glasses and have false teeth. I mean, what's up with that, right? I mean, physician, heal thyself kind of thing. So what is, faith healing is, we go to the hospital and pray with sick people, but we're there to comfort them and their families. We're not there to cure them. If there's any curing going on, that's what the doctors do. We don't do that. We're there to comfort and support and encourage and worry about the state of their souls, but we let the doctors fix the body. So when somebody has these faith-healing instant cures, that's suspicious stuff. It's beyond suspicious stuff. That's not real. And so everything in my theology is based on not accepting that experience of other people. And all of a sudden, in my empirical view, in a congregation where I'm preaching, I witness this happening. To me, that is a theological body slam shock. Right? How can I explain this? Can I explain this? How can this be real? And so while all of this, everybody's joyful and all that, I'm having to cope with something outside of my belief system. And I really believe what I am doing up to that point. Suddenly, what I believe is challenged. Do you understand the nuance there? So while I'm very happy people got healed and all of that, I don't know how that happened. I can't explain that. This is not to be believed with me. And if this is not to be believed, my whole theology is in jeopardy. So I'm wrestling with this. Well, the preacher disappears. And I tell the people to get back in your pews. I'm trying to bring about order, calm, order. Help us with the chairs. Miss Carly, I'm glad you're playing the piano, but we need to bring this to a close. And the preacher comes back and said, open up the altar. So I do an altar call, and the other pianist takes over and starts playing the altar call music, and we're there until midnight. Everybody came to the altar and was counseled, and people that had been saved all of their lives got resaved that night. It was the most amazing thing. And I didn't know it, but there was a reporter in the congregation. See, I got there late, and this hit the newspapers and the radio that night. Wasn't much television in those days, but newspapers and the radio. Teenage evangelist has faith healing service in Coleman Hill Baptist Church. Saturday, I get up to go do Bible study. There's 500 people there. Sunday, I get up to go preach the Sunday morning service. There's 20,000 people there. They have to put up speakers in the trees. We have to bring contractors in. We have a service. I make, because how I got paid is whatever came in the collection plate on the last Sunday. I made $20,000 cash that Sunday, which is, they didn't do that at the biggest Baptist churches in Houston and Dallas.
But the arc of your life, Ray, you from this, from your family, to your skepticism, to
Well, that's where I became a participating skeptic, because not only did I not believe this was possible, but I had witnessed it empirically. So I'm in the throes of a theological crisis. So I moved to Coleman-Hill, Texas, and 2 weeks later, Miss Carly's back in the wheelchair. She never plays another note for the rest of her life. The people who were cured of cancer died of it. The man with the goiter that went away has it back. And this is the, that what wasn't possible but became real turned out not to be real either. So I said, I can't do this anymore. Then I looked at the money. And by looked at the money, I literally looked at the money. And what the money was old, crumpled bills. I'm not talking about, there wasn't a new, crisp bills in the collection. It was old, crumpled bills. And that was money that was very important for somebody's children's education. That was very important for somebody's parents' health care. That was money very valuable to poor people. And I had blown into town, and by trickery that didn't last, took their money. I couldn't do that anymore. I would later not worry at all about stealing from the rich, but I certainly was concerned about stealing from those poor people, those good, honest people. And so I couldn't believe anymore. And so I stopped. That was the last sermon I preached. I decided later what had happened was I came in a very emotional way, brought their attention to whatever it was they felt, brought their attention to whatever it was they felt guilty about. Now, what can good, honest country folk feel guilty about? I don't know, but they knew. And what had happened is that they had a lot of
you gave them relief from that.
maladies. And when their guilt, their guilt was resolved, their maladies went away.
Yeah, you released them from their shame for a while.
But they couldn't sustain that.
Yeah.
And so when their guilts came back, the maladies that they only thought had been healed came back. So Carly's arthritis, somebody else's goiter, somebody else's cancer, a man that hadn't spoken in years was singing praises to the Lord, and his wife was trying to get him to shut up.
Right. Consider this. Awareness makes the universe, not the other way around. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that's fine, but the trouble with being 17 is you're 17. Okay? I don't have any context to analyze.
I don't, but I mean, think about it now.
Well, now I think I would probably take the whole thing with some good year. I wouldn't have believed. My problem was when I saw the healing, I believed it. And when it turned out to be not true, that was the second theological body blow. Does that make sense?
It does, but, and I don't mean, maybe forgive this, me if I seem argumentative, but maybe it was true.
No, I thought that to be true, it would have to at least last a month. But it didn't last 2 weeks. Damn.
I just mean the issue about their awareness and their shame being relieved.
Oh, I believe that's true. I believe that's true to my heart. I don't know. The one good thing here, the one good thing is those people's simple faith. That's good. I don't have any quarrel with that. You can believe what you want to, and as long as you believe it, I'm like John C. Lilly. Whatsoever you believe to be true either is true or will prove true within the parameters of your experience. That's right out of the center of the cyclone, and I took it for gospel in the 60s, and I take it for gospel now. But for Ray Hill, the theological matrix out of which all of that happened is chicanery. And it violates my ethics.
That comes from that, you know, that thing, that Steve Martin screenplay.
Yep.
It's the same premise.
Same premise. Same premise.
Same thing happened to him.
Same thing happened.
Except it really happened to you.
It really happened. When I was 17 years old. And ill prepared to cope with it. So, I decided that, well, there was this scene where I go back to the trailer where I've been drinking all this time, pulling one drunk after another, but only I leave off the alcohol, I take the money, and I take my Bible, and I go and I try to make contact.
With God.
With God. I pray, and for the first time in my life, no one answered the phone. No, nothing. Zero. Zilch. Not impressions, not feelings, not even smoke and mirrors. I mean, there wasn't anybody at home. And I'm praying fervently, and I'm mad. One thing I had periodically prayed that I be healed of being gay. All right? I wanted to be normal. And he had healed those other people, all but temporarily, but he hadn't given me any relief at all. And I felt shortchanged. So here I am doing the best that I can to make contact. It ain't nobody at home. I finally look at the money and to decide about the poor people thing, and I throw the money around and I throw the Bible up against the wall, and I leave that place with the money, but I didn't take the Bible with me. I was through with that. And I wouldn't preach for 30 years.
Just an apostrophe. You 30 years. So when did you come back to preaching?
When my friend Troy Perry of Metropolitan Community Church called me and said, congregation in Phoenix, Arizona is about to cannibalize my pastor. Will you go help them settle it? And I went over and preached in Phoenix, Arizona. And I preached on the subject of the Good Samaritan. It's in two of the Gospels. It's a story of a story by Jesus, repeated in the Gospels, of the Jew on the road to Jericho that gets waylaid, and that's what I use for scripture. But I tell the story of my having a motorcycle accident, Patrick and I having a motorcycle accident in Austin, Texas, and my being laid up with a broken clavicle and a broken leg in Breckenridge Hospital in need of some serious medical services. They tell me that I was an indigent entitled to public health care. I don't have insurance, but I was an indigent that belonged to Harris County, not one that belonged to Travis County. And they wanted me to get myself to Harris County. But when I checked with Harris County, they said, oh, you're manager of KPFT, make $1,000. You're not an indigent. We'll be more than glad to provide you service. It'll cost you about $40,000. So I'm desperate. They got me packed on ice. I have broken bones. I'm in need of some serious medical treatment. And we put out a call, and Madeline Murray O'Hare herself and her good son John show up at Breckenridge Hospital in a Cadillac that would do a black preacher proud, and they carry me to Bel Air General Hospital in Houston, where atheist doctors come out of the woodwork, cut me to pieces, put me back together, patch me up, give me the best health care you can have for a man with broken bones, provide me with a year of physical therapy so that I walk with a gimp and not really a limp, and I never did get a bill. That is the Good Samaritan story. And so the end of that message is we are commanded to love our neighbor, and the question is, who is your neighbor? And the most hated woman in Christendom is indeed my neighbor. Who is yours? And how are you treating that? With your prejudices and your fears and your angers and your tendency to think you are better than others.
Ray, doth you protest too much?
Well, it's pretty heavy hammer, but
No, I mean, your faith.
my faith is good. Well, my faith is good for. See, I think the metaphor is.
You just refuse to use it as a con.
Yeah, I can't do that anymore. Can't do that. I got the principles down. But if you actually read in Matthew, that's where Christ says what to do in Matthew. You know, he goes through a litany of things that you all have done for me, and they said, well, when did we do that? I mean, when did we come see you in jail? I mean, what are you talking about? You say that you have done it to the least of these. Who actually does that? If you compare me with Ed Young, I do that a lot more than Ed Young. Now, we were going to stop at the Chinese restaurant and get something to eat.
Oh, I got the crackers mostly for nausea.
Okay.
I have to cut. I'm
Yeah,
just gonna,
it's time to take a break.
I'm gonna psychically explode.
Good evening. I'm Ray Hill, and this is Public Affairs, Public Access, and this is a program that is produced by Houston Media Source to do something very different with these radio waves, these television waves. Actually, to me, it means that I can come in here once a month and be Ray Hill, and they tell me, think of something to do, and I come in and I usually announce in advance what I'm going to do. And that's discussed, and then I try to bring you some film or something to go with all of this head talking, because just a talking head doesn't necessarily do you a lot of good, but I hope it'll stimulate you to some thought. Tonight's topic is when cops go bad. One of my producers over at KPFT's The Prison Show posted it as when good cops go bad, and I said, no, I don't think that's a good idea. My title is When Cops Go Bad. And then there was some discussion that this would be an opinion piece. And I said, no, it's actually not an opinion piece. It is an account of my experiences and experiences of others to which I was close enough to observe what is going on. The only opinion in this piece is perhaps in the context in which I tell these stories, because you can tell them in a vacuum, or you can do a little setup and tell them, and that requires formulating some kind of opinion. But I do want to caution you that these are my experiences or experiences of people near me, cases that I worked on, and other people may have different experiences. And that's just the way life is. Some of us see a green car as teal, some of us see it as green, and some may even think it's blue, but it only has to do with our reception of that color. When you talk about when cops go bad or when cop behavior is not tolerable, I've worked on over a dozen cases where a Houston police officer or a law enforcement officer from elsewhere in the county killed an unarmed person. I say dozens of cases because I've been called by families and friends and people that were shot in these circumstances. And over a period of many years, it took about 25 years and a dozen or more such cases before the first cop that killed, in this case, Eli Escobar, was actually convicted in a state court. Most of them are exonerated in state court. The Joe Campos Torres case was exonerated in state court. And the Ida Delaney case was exonerated in state court. The Byron Gilliam case was exonerated in state court. It wasn't until Eli Escobar case, a 14-year-old special education student who was held to the ground by two officers. One of them pulled his gun and blew Eli's brains out. Fortunately, there were about a half a dozen witnesses to that. And I was on the scene the day after that happened and lined the witnesses up. Because what happens when something like this occurs is that all of the forces of government, the district attorney's office, the investigators, the police internal affairs investigators, everyone begins a process of trying to prove that the officer was justified in doing it. In Eli Escobar's case, because I had a list of all the witnesses and I kept intimidating the district attorney's office that if he didn't produce those witnesses for the grand jury, that I would figure out somehow to do that. So the officer was indicted. Well, indictment is one thing. I mean, my sidekick, Fred Pies, was assassinated by Kevin McCoy, a Houston police officer, just about a block from where I am sitting as we broadcast this show. And I heard about that, about 6 hours after it happened, and I came to be at the scene where Fred was killed. When I drove up to the scene, there was District Attorney Johnny Holmes, who was district attorney at the time. There was John Donovan, a homicide investigator that both Fred and I knew, and there was a television crew, and Kevin McCoy and the other officers were going through a process of videotaping their version of what happened. Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that what they're doing is they're preparing something for the officers to testify to, of prepared evidence, so that the officer can, if he actually winds up going to trial, figure out a way to be exonerated. The trial didn't happen for a year and a half. The Brian Raines, who was appointed to prosecute Kevin McCoy, who is now a state judge, Brian was the prosecutor in that case, but Brian was just a puppy out of University of Texas Law School. He just drove up. He'd never tried a case, certainly not a case of homicide, dealing with the kind of complexities that a homicide case deals with. And I worked with Brian as close as you could imagine. But of course, when we had final arguments, my mother, myself, my companion, Kent Nas, and Terry Shaw were the only civilians in the courtroom. Every other seat was occupied by a uniformed police officer in uniform, bearing a weapon with his hands on the weapon as the jury heard final arguments. Needless to say, Kevin McCoy was acquitted, but at least I got him indicted, and I got him tried. Probably if someone with more trial experience than Brian Raines had been the chief prosecutor, we might have got a conviction, but we didn't. We wouldn't get that conviction. That was, gosh, in 1981. We wouldn't get that conviction until after 2001, 2002, whenever Eli Escobar's case was tried. But you understand there are dozens of people, unarmed people, killed with police weapons in Harris County every year. You don't even read about most of them in the newspaper. Or if you do, it's a 3-line story buried on a back page. Few of those cases get seriously investigated. Even fewer of them get submitted to the grand jury for indictment. Only a scant percentage of those submitted to the grand jury get indictments because the district attorney can control every word presented to the grand jury, and grand juries themselves are predisposed not to indict police officers for what they do. The bloodshed is enormous. Some of the cases make big headlines. There are organizations around some of the cases. The Ada Edwards organization, the Ida Delaney attempt. I mean, there for a good many years, Councilmember Ada Edwards and I were accused of being Siamese twins because we were back to back against police excesses. They happen a lot. I have been out of prison since 1975, and over those years I've been arrested over a dozen times, and 4 of those arrests have resulted in suits against the city of Houston for either the constitutionality of the ordinance or the behavior of the police in those instances. I've not lost any of those cases. My famous case, Hill versus Houston, the United States Supreme Court case, I was on my porch on my house. I was living at the corner of Westheimer and Whitney. I think that's now a pizza place, but it had a porch then, and that's an enclosed part of the restaurant now. I was on the porch when I saw 2 police officers grab a young black man, Charles Hill, who was skipping down the sidewalk with a white woman, holding a white woman's hand, and the officers took offense at that, and they started pressuring Charles, and he had some kind of nervous reaction to that. And they interpreted that as aggression. So they dragged him over into my front yard, right at my feet, pulled out their flashlights and commenced to beat him. And I said, oh, wait a minute. This is my yard, and I've got some say as to what happens here. And I've been out here long enough to know that that kid has done nothing wrong to deserve this ass whooping. And the officer looked at me and said, you better get in the house, you SOB, or we'll take your ass to jail. I said, I think that's a good idea. And then I called him a name unbecoming of his relationship with his mother. And they, of course, forgot all about Charles at that point and let him go and arrested me. And they threw me in the back of the squad car. I was crippled. I was recovering from a motorcycle accident. And so I was on crutches. So I gave my companion, Patricio Bravo, the crutches, and Patricio was calling them far worse things than I was, but he was doing it in Spanish, and these gringo cops didn't understand what he was saying. They threw me in the back of the squad car. Now, this is in Montrose. We're only a few blocks down the chute to the 61 Reasoner Street police station. We don't go there. We head out to the Beech Nut substation. Let me tell you about the Beech Nut substation in those years. This is 1982. They find bones, human bones, in the field behind the Beech Nut substation. Bones that belonged to people whose last known location was the Beech Nut substation. It was a secret hole in the system where the violence was going on at the time, and they were carrying me out there, and I'm 40 years old, recovering from a motorcycle accident. I can't take this ass whooping, so I said, look, officer, look in the wallet. And one of the officers looked in the wallet, and I said, see the press pass? I'm really Lois Lane. And there are just some people that you can't get away with brutality and violence, and I happen to be one of them. I mean, if I come up missing, there'll be a lot of questions asked. I'm not an unknown person in India. I was general manager at KPFT at the time. And I said, if that happens, then there'll be a stink, and I've got access to media. And so they closed the little window and looked at the press pass and discussed. And when we got out to Beech Nut, the sergeant out there knew me, so I was given reasonable, comfortable accommodations. And I spent the whole weekend in jail. And when I got out of jail, I went to municipal court, and Judge Breen was the judge in that court, because I knew all the other judges too well for them to be entirely neutral in my cases. So Judge Breen was sitting up there, and he listened to all of the evidence. And after the state presented, the two officers testified, and then they had several other officers testify as to those officers' reputation for truth and veracity, because I had won some cases prior to that where I challenged the officers telling the truth, and had won those cases. So they brought in a bunch of officers to say these officers didn't lie. And whenever they got through with the state's case, it was my turn. I was representing myself. Judge Breen kept asking me, "You have any questions for this officer, Mr. Hill?" "No." "Do you have any questions for this officer, Mr. Hill?" "No." So finally it was my turn, and Judge Breen said, "Now it's your turn, Mr. Hill." And I said, "Well, before I present a defense, I'd like to enter a motion to quash." A motion to quash is a mechanism whereby on a point of law you bring the court's attention that no evidence has been presented in the opposing case that gives rise to a violation of the law. And so Judge Breen said, "Well, that's kind of fancy stuff for this lowly municipal court." And I said, "Yes, sir, Your Honor, but I'm pro se, and I'm not an officer of the court. I'm a layperson. And I think the rules are you got to be tolerant of me." And he said, "Well, I'll listen to your motion to quash." So I stood up and I said, "Your Honor, I was clearly, if everything the officer said was true, and I haven't challenged any of it in cross-examination, it is very clear at this point that I was arrested for what I said. And to be arrested and incarcerated for what one says is a case that requires very close examination under the First Amendment. I may have called them a name. They testified to that effect. But my interference with their arrest was by words only. And if it's what I said, I would ask the court to dismiss this case on the grounds that the First Amendment protects my words." Well, the judge scratched his head and said, "Well, Mr. Hill, you understand this court's position." And he said, I think that's a very worthy issue to raise in an appellate court, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to find you guilty." And I looked shocked. I said, "Your Honor, you've found me guilty, and I haven't even presented a defense. That was a motion to quash. I mean, I'm present with witnesses, perfectly prepared to present a defense, and this court is not allowing me to present a defense." What had happened there is he had messed up the record, because I saw to it that everything was being recorded in the stenographer. And it was him, it wasn't me. I didn't mess up the record. He did. He just decided he was going to find me guilty, even though I had not had an opportunity to present a defense. And so he thought about that for me. He said, "Well, in that case, Mr. Hill, I think I'll find you not guilty." I never did get to present that defense, but since he had screwed up the record. But that being settled, I left where my lawyers were waiting on me outside, and we were discussing a federal case, and I realized that I had left a folder in the courtroom. So I got on the elevator and went back downstairs, and I went into the courtroom where my folder was, and there were those two officers, Tommy Belot, the chief prosecutor for the city, and the judge up at the desk going through what those officers should testify to sustain a conviction. I want you to think about that for a minute. I've just been acquitted from a Class C misdemeanor. Fine only, no jail time, although I went to jail on it. And now they're gathered around the front of the court, and the judge and the prosecutor are teaching the officers what they need to say to win a conviction. If this country was what this country is supposed to be, they would say, officers, observe what you observe, come here, testify the truth, and we'll determine whether or not the arrest was justified and a conviction can be sustained. But that's not what's happening here. They're teaching the officers how to represent, or in many cases, misrepresent the facts in order to glean a conviction for the state. It really starts in traffic court. You run a stop sign, you run a red light, you have a crack in your windshield, your sticker's expired. The officers come in there and they don't testify as to what they witnessed and what happened. They come and testify as to what they have been trained to say to sustain a conviction. It starts right there. In the lowest level of court, in the most chicken stuff of cases, the truth is what loses here. And the officers are trained by prosecutors and frequently judges as to what to say to make the conviction work. And then you move up a notch and you're being arrested for theft, shoplifting. So you picked up an item and you're walking around the store looking for something else to buy. The house detective comes over and stops you, comes to court and testifies you were attempting to leave the store with what you had picked up. He doesn't testify that you were over in another department, which may or may not share the same cash register, which may or may not have a barricade to get from to. He doesn't testify as to the truth of the matter. He has been trained, or she has been trained, to testify as to what they've got to say in that court to sustain a conviction. Let's move up a notch. Let's take the marijuana cigarette. You know, not the one on your pocket, but the one that the officer mysteriously found at the ground on your feet. The officer says, I testified. Watch, the officer will testify, I saw him reach in his underwear, take out the marijuana cigarette, and throw it down on the ground. Well, that took a brain scientist to figure that out. I mean, if you wanted to destroy the evidence, you would have eaten it, not thrown it down on the ground. And maybe that didn't happen at all. Maybe the officer found it in his pocket. But he is going to testify what he has been trained to say in order to sustain a conviction. Let's take a case that I'm very familiar with. I was out at a radio talk show host convention out at the Astro Complex. Oh, by the way, what happened to the case that I went to Beechnut Substation? That case would ultimately go all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States because I wound up suing the city for the inconvenience of spending a week in jail. And the Supreme Court of the United States took a long look at the case and said that the ordinance, number one, was unconstitutional because of overbreadth and that it could be applied to somebody in violation of the First Amendment. It was the landmark First Amendment case, the last majority First Amendment case written by a court where Justice Brennan was writing for the majority. The vote was 8-1. Only Justice Rehnquist voted. I got Scalia's vote and O'Connor's vote, and Scalia and O'Connor voted my way, and basically the Supreme Court said, we thought everybody knew about cops and their mamas. I mean, we don't know why this man got arrested. The ordinance under which he was arrested was unconstitutional. They paid my lawyers $650,000 taxpayer dollars to struggle the case all the way to the Supreme Court. And they paid me $50 a minute for the time I spent in jail. That's, by the way, my rate for going to jail, is when I'm in jail, my rate for being arrested for bull stuff is $50 a minute. And so if you hear on the radio or read in the newspaper, Ray Hill's been arrested, don't bail me out. I can't do anything else than earn $50 a minute, but as long as I'm being held for some unconstitutional police action, $50 a minute is my rate, and so leave me alone. I know what I'm doing. The subsequent case is Andy called me and said the police officers have taken over my video store up on 59, Highway 59, up around, what's the name of those streets? Cross Timbers and Tidwell up there. So I said, and I was at a talk show conference. And so he said, can you go up there and restore my control of my business? And I said, sure, Andy, I'll go up there and do that. So I drove up there and have enough sense to drive past it and around the block and back to it. And I noticed that there was several police cars in the field behind the bookstore. Has an arcade there. And so I drove up front, and sure enough, I saw the security camera, caught me driving up and getting out of my car, and I walked in the door, and there over the counter where the cash register is another security camera. So I tell the clerk, I said, turn that camera on me over there at that door, and turn up, if you have a way of doing that, so that it pick up the sound. And so this poor clerk was scared to death. Cops had been overrunning the back. So I went over to the door where the arcade was, and I opened the door, and I shouted in there. And I'm not going to use the rough language I'd use, because after you win a case for calling them names unbecoming of their relationship to their mothers, you learn that language is a real motivator for police overreaction. So I do that. I call them all kinds of names and tell them to come out here and talk about this crap with Ray Hill. And in just a few minutes, I'm swarmed with police officers. And so all of this is in that security camera right overhead, down on me, watching me. So they put me in handcuffs, and then there's discussion, oh my God, we've arrested Ray Hill. Don't you think we better check with somebody? And then there's a discussion about, no, that's not necessary. We're not going to do that. We're just going to take him to jail. And so they wound up taking me to jail behind that. And they carried me out to the Macawa substation, which at the time was probably the correct place to go. But the chief jailer was out there, and he rushed out and opened up squad car door and said, oh, Mr. Hill, we heard you were coming, and would you like to wait in my office until your release arrangement? And I said, no, I'm in custody. I'm in your office. I'm under arrest. I deserve and expect a cell, preferably one with telephone service. And so he put me in a whole wing by myself and sent a young black jailer in there to keep me company. Well, he wasn't young, he had gray hair, and he and I talked about old times in Houston and being gay and being black. He being black, me being gay. And so we had a nice long conversation in there, and it was good to have the company. And the jailer came back and said, Mr. Hill, we noticed that you haven't really been processed through fingerprinting in 20 years. And I said, well, if you want to do that, that's fine. I'm in custody. I got to do what you want me to do, but I don't think my fingerprints have changed much. And he said, no, but we've got new equipment. And so they were going into electronic fingerprinting. So we went in there, and there was a whole bunch of us going through the jail to get to the fingerprinting places, a couple of captains and sergeant and my escort and the chief jailer and the cops in there said, man, who is this guy? I mean, who is this guy? And I said, well, I'm Judon Boney's brother, which is close enough. And so we went in, and I was fingerprinted and got out. That case resulted in, I went to court for a first appearance, and there was the offense report. And my lawyer brought it over so I could read the offense report. And the officers wrote in that report that I had come into the store, gone into the arcade, which never happened, made a pass, tried to solicit one of the vice officers for sexual behavior, and I had to look at all of them, and none of them were worthy of my time. And knocked on people's doors on the booth and told them the cops are here, and went in the back and opened up the fire escape at the back of the arcade. And none of that happened. So at the time, now Assistant Police Chief George Bunick was in charge of internal affairs, so I called George. And I said, George, I mean, I hate to sound naive, but I never dreamed that the officers would lie in my case. And I know they lie in cases all the time, but I never dreamed. And anyway, I've got this videotape of everything that happened in that store. Now, what do you mean to do? You want me to go through this trial and get that completed? Or do you want me to make a complaint in internal affairs now? And George said, I want to see that tape. And so I took him at his word, and I carried him a copy of the tape. I didn't take him the original. Carried him a copy of the tape, and I gave it to George. And he looked at it, and he looked at the offense report. And he saw what the offense report said, and he saw what the videotape proved. I drove in the parking lot, got out of the parking lot, went in the front door, hollered at the cops, and never left the front part of the store until they carried me out the front door. Well, we showed up in Judge Peters County Criminal Court for trial. Now, Judge Peters had assembled a jury pool of about 50 people because he knew that if you're going to have a trial about Ray Hill, there are people out there who hate me. Like some of you watch this show, hate my guts because I'm the guy that exposes police behavior. I'm the guy that doesn't have any tolerance for white supremacy. I'm the guy that supports the gay rights. I'm the guy that stands for fair treatment of prisoners and their families. Just a whole bunch of you out there really upset by that. And he don't want any of those people on my jury. And then there's a whole bunch of you out there that think that those are good and worthy things to do. And so you like Ray Hill. Well, we can't put you on the jury if you're prejudiced in my behalf or if you're prejudiced against me. So we get in the courtroom, and Judge Peters said, where could you produce the officers so we can proffer them before the jury and see if any of them are known by the jurors? And the prosecutor gets up and said, I'm sorry, Your Honor, the officers have all been suspended. And Judge said, suspended? What for? Filing a false document under oath. In what case? In this case. And so I jumped up and I said, Your Honor, my lawyer's sitting there, but I said, Your Honor, could we postpone the trial until the officers get back from their suspension? And he said, Mr. Hill, my court can be used for a lot of things, but to get sworn testimony in preparation for your federal case is not one of them. This case is dismissed with prejudice against the state, and we'll go on to the next order of business. And he dismissed the jury pool, and they went back, liking me or disliking me, to the jury pool room where they got their $6 and went home. You see, there's a pattern developing here of mendacity. Mendacity. And Judge Peters did a far better job of dealing with the situation than Judge Breen had. At least he didn't hold a seminar with the prosecutors and officers to teach them how they needed to come in there and testify as to these exact words, regardless of what the facts are, to sustain a conviction. At this point in the time, some of you are going to be called for jury duty. Right? And you're going to go down and you say, oh, I don't want to spend my time. Don't do that. It is a great honor and joy to make this country work correctly. So if you get a jury summons, go. But when you go, remember that cops can, do, often lie. They lie because they've been trained to lie by the whole system. And if you are on the jury and always tell them that, yeah, you will weigh the evidence and draw a conclusion true, when you're on the jury, you are the sole arbiter of who is telling the truth and who is not telling the truth. You. Enormous power as a jury. And you know what? They'll tell you that as to the witnesses, but it's more than that. When you're on the jury, watch that judge. Because right now in Harris County, most judges are little better than prosecutors in a judge dress. And you get to decide whether the judge is telling the truth or not. They will tell you, the judge will tell you what is the law. Well, you get to decide whether the judge is telling you the law within their prejudices or not. And you can come to the conclusion that the used to be prosecutors still thinking like a prosecutor judge has been less than truthful as to what the law is. You've got the right as a jury to decide that a law is silly. We've already got too many people locked up. This is the most incarcerating nation in the world. And most of those laws are ridiculous. And a lot of the testimony that happens in trials is equally ridiculous. I think narcotics officers lie most of the time. You remember that story about the joint? They kind of make up the ancillary facts to get the point across to win the conviction. Vice officers lie every time. There is no such thing as a vice officer who gets on. I had one assistant police chief testify about a vice officer. I called him Officer Winnie Wiggle in the park. The assistant chief in a very important case came up and said that this officer, if his lips were moving and he was under oath, he was lying except telling you what he did for a living. That was testimony in trial. Of course, that officer sued the assistant police chief for so testifying, but the case was not successful. Because it was true. It was true. That officer, who I knew well, had entrapped so many people and told a lie in every case after case after. And he was very proud of that work. He boasted. I ran into him in a topless club one time, and he was standing there and had a dancer sitting next to him with his hand up her skirt. And I said, what are you in here for, some undercover? He said, no, this is where I recreate. This is where I spend my time. But I just don't tolerate them queers. I mean, I'm just not going to do that. You're all right, but the rest of them are slimy. And he had lied in every case, and every police officer knew about it. And so, what do? They rarely will testify against one another. If you want to join today's discussion, I'm going to ask the producer to put up the telephone. You're welcome to call in, and we can talk about your experiences if you want to, or we can talk in more detail about my experiences. The telephone number is 713-807-1794. Today is September the 20th, and you're welcome to call in when you want to. 713-807-1794. Give us a call, and I'll put you on there, and we can chat. But I've been fighting cops for many times. I've sued them 4 times. I always won. My first case, I was in the basement of the courthouse. And Officer Kroll said, let me see your Raymond called me by name. Let me see your driver's license. I said, Kroll, I don't need a driver's license in the basement of this courthouse. And so he threw me up against the wall and handcuffed me, and Judge Sam Alfano was on his way back to court and heard on the telephone, on the radio, that KTRH, that I had been arrested in the basement of the courthouse. And so we got over there and he called the jailer and he said, you got Ray Hill over there? And he said, yeah, I got Ray Hill. The jailer said, he's standing here right next to me. He said, well, send him over here and I'll release him on his own recognizance. And so the jailer looked at me and said, Ray, the judge, Sam wants to see you, and the drunks are going crazy. I don't have an officer to spare. Just go over there and see the judge. He'll cut you loose. So I walked over there by myself, walked in the courtroom. Sam said, I thought you were under arrest. I said, I am. Well, where's your officer? And I said, well, they didn't give me one. And so he started scolding me about not having an officer. And so, but we got our way through with it. I was in jail for an hour and 40 minutes. The settlement, when we got through winning that case and going to federal court and suing and winning that case, was $5,000 plus lawyer's fees. $5,000 for 100 minutes is $50 a minute. Stare decisis, that's my fee for going to jail. Hello, you're on the air.
Hello?
Hello.
Hey, Ray?
I hope so. I wouldn't want people to think I was impersonating that guy.
Nah, nonsense, man. Nah. So tell me, in your own experience, you know, I mean, I know you, cause I think so, the way I think you were talking about that, I think what you did back in the store was kind of cool, you know, was kind of right, though.
Well, going to jail is not cool, and I don't want to give the impression to nice, young, innocent people in the audience like yourself that it's cool to go to jail. It's not. It's sometimes necessary to go to jail. If there's an issue, I have never been arrested except for the time I went to prison sentenced to 160 years. For anything that I did not think about ahead of time and decide that there was a constitutional issue involved.
Really?
Now you got too much feedback. Whatever you're listening to needs to be turned down.
Got it.
Okay, that'll work better. But no, if there's not a constitutional issue involved, I am the most law-abiding citizen you can imagine. There is nothing unconstitutional about the prostitution laws, so I don't go chasing hookers. There is nothing unconstitutional about, at the present time, the drug laws. I hope someday there will be, but right now there's not, and so I have spent the last 48 and a half years alcohol and drug-free. I know that's
a bit hard on you.
No, I know that sounds disappointing to fellows like you, but you know, in a room where even the cops are stoned, I'm thinking clearer than everybody. And you know, the cops are pretty good distributors of dope.
Well.
Yeah, but see, I remember there was this place over near 4th Ward on Genesee Street. It'd been a crack house in that house for over 25 years that I know of.
Wow.
And a couple of years ago, I was driving by it, and there was a paddy wagon out in front of the house, and they were taking things out of the house, putting paddy wagon. And so I knew the officer that was doing that, and I said, y'all finally closed down this crack house. And he said, no, they're going to build a row of townhouses here, so this house is going to get tore down. We just moved this operation somewhere else. The crack house had been operated by the police for 25 years. Are you ready?
I understand what you're saying, man.
And if you went over there, and here's, suppose you were walking innocently through Montrose or 4th Ward, and some guy in a pickup truck who looks like he's from Crockett, Texas, pulls up and says, can you get me a rock? I got $20 here for you to get me. Oh, do you know a rock don't cost $20?
Yeah, that's perfect, man. I've been through jail before.
Okay, so you know a rock don't cost you $20. Sure, you $20 sounds good. Give me the 20 and you go buy the rock and put the change in your pocket. Well, you have just taken money from a cop to go buy a rock from a cop to deliver to the same cop you got the money from. That's a delivery case. And I know dumb kids that have been arrested 3 times, twice by the same cop doing that.
I know the feeling, man. Trust me.
That's that operation. Well, I appreciate you calling in.
All right, anytime, man.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I'm Ray Hill. I'm having a good time on the telephone. Excuse me for giving a young man advice, but I do that a lot. I hope that something I say causes people who are not accustomed to getting arrested to snap. And don't let that happen. Unless, of course, there's a constitutional issue involved. Are you there?
Yes, Ray.
Yes.
I strongly believe for what you stand for.
Thank you, sir.
And I really want to applaud you for your what you're standing for and what you're talking about, because I have a dear friend of mine that's locked up in Harris County Jail all because she suffers from mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
The system is railroading her.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a shame that we live in the most powerful country in the world and we have corrupt cops.
Well, it's not just corrupt cops, the whole system. Let me tell you something about people with mental illness. If somebody has mental illness and they get in treatment, if they ever cross that line and get out of the mental health system into the criminal justice system, there's no way back. Because after that first conviction, they will be tried on their record.
That's right.
Do you understand?
Number.
Yeah, if you've already had a case, so there's no way to get you back into the mental health system. And while you're in prison, ain't nothing happening to treat you for your mental illness. Nothing. The most tragic thing in the world I have ever witnessed. You know, I served 4 years, 4 months, and 17 days on that 160-year sentence. And sitting down there watching the abuse of people who are mentally and emotionally handicapped in that very predatory society is a horrible thing to witness.
Yes, it is.
Most tragic thing in the world.
And that's true, Ray, because I've been through the Harris County system myself. You know, I'm not an angel. And I've seen the treatment that's received there by the jailers. My question to you is, why is it that a person that suffers from mental illness has to sit 6 months in jail and continue to have it reset and reset? And instead of trying to help the person, giving her necessary help to better her, they just continue to institutionalize.
If you want to change the system, change the district attorney. That's something you as a voter can do. And you're going to have an opportunity to do that next year. If you have feelings for how mental health sufferers are treated in the hands of custody, because it doesn't take a district attorney 30 minutes to go in there and get the person who don't belong in that institution out of it in another, but the one we've got now and the ones we have had most of my life, not since Carol Vance, are not sensitive at all to those issues. Change the district attorney and the policy will be different. Okay?
Thank you, sir. I appreciate your time and thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. You can join us at 713-807-1794. Wonderful questions concern people about real issues, and I deal with that, those kind of things. If you kind of like what I have to say about criminal justice, listen to the Prison Show. I'm on tomorrow night and every Friday night on KPFT 90.1 FM. Hello, you're on the air.
Hi, my name is Mary. How are you?
Hi, Mary. I'm Ray. Glad to have you.
Well, I just happened to be turning to your show, and I think I was led to talk with you.
Okay, what can I do for you?
That was incarcerated behind aggravated sexual assault.
Oh, good Lord, sex crimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, those things are so blown out of proportion and so ridiculous.
Yeah, and it's all behind a jealous girlfriend.
Oh.
I say this only because I know my son, and I know he has children. He has children this child's age, and they were not able to find anything where my son had touched her or anything like that. So the medical records didn't find anything. It was just the little girl's word against his.
Well, ma'am,
Now, yes,
I understand, and let me tell you something about sex crimes, because I do the prison show. Half of my staff is sex offenders. None of my staff are predators, but they're so emotional. Most sex crimes fall into two categories. One of them, some person over the age of consent, 17, 18, 19, falls in love with somebody under the age of consent, 14, 15, 16, and everybody has a good time except her mother. All right? The other large group of sex crimes are people who came out of family court, divorces, disgruntled girlfriends, jilted lovers, who don't want justice or seeking revenge. And if you have a civilian with so little ethics that nothing prevents them from lying under oath to sustain a conviction, you ruin the lives of the people charged forever. Hopefully someday we will come up with a formula to do something about it. And Texas is a state where that's likely because we're so extreme in sex crimes. But I'm not going to be able to resolve your son's case on the radio, on the television. I talk about it all the time on the radio. But listen up. I'm on Friday nights on KPFT.
okay, I will.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
It's just anguishing. My son had a girlfriend. She had children. They broke up. She accused him of messing with an underage child, and there goes his life. May not be true. If it is true, we need to look at it, but it may not be true. It frequently is not. This is Ray.
Hello, Ray. How you doing?
I am very well, thank you.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes, sir.
How you doing?
I didn't go to Jenna today. I wished I had. But that is just another example of a criminal justice system gone wild.
Okay. Now, my question is this here. I own a club in South Park, and I got a notice from last week before last, and told them that we can't smoke in the club anymore. Now my club went from making $2,000 to $500 to maybe $200 a week in the last 2 weeks, and now I'm looking at the way my week just went by, and I made about maybe $100 a week, and now they sent me a notice saying that I have to pay my $3,500 taxes, and I can't because of their ban. Is there any way that I can get around that ban?
No.
No?
No. You can call the mayor and thank him for ruining your business. You can knock out a back wall and build a large patio. Those are the only alternatives at your disposal.
So I can't even turn my club into a private club?
No. There's no private club thing with smoking. Smoking is going to be smoking is going to be. I quit smoking in 1994 and promised that I would never become a no-smoking Nazi. You know what I mean?
I understand what you're saying. It's just like they're saying, I'm just about to close my business down because of this.
Well, it's affecting everybody in your business, and if you think it's affecting you, what about all those clubs in the gay community that are affected?
Yeah, I know. I seen a couple of y'all, the clubs up there on Westham, look like the skeleton crew up there.
Okay. Have a good one.
You too, sir.
And yeah, how the law is used and who uses it, it's a pecking order system. If you've got power, exercise it. My last show, and they do reruns on that, was about the arrogance of power. Let's see, is that another income? Yeah, you're on the air. Hello.
Can you pick up the phone?
No, because the microphone works this way.
Okay, thank you.
You want to talk to me privately? Is that what the deal is?
Yes.
Well, then call me at home. I'm listed.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Other folks don't list their telephone number. Mine's in the phone book. You can always find me. one of the most accessible people in the world. Sometimes that's a problem, but you know, I don't get hate calls. You're on the air.
Yes. Oh.
And now your television's too high.
Okay, yeah, I got my television down now. Okay, Mr. Hill, I love the prison show. Love
Thank
what
you.
you do on KPFT.
Appreciate it.
And I was wondering if you think that getting arrested sometimes is kind of counterproductive to being an activist. If people just think of you as a maverick, getting arrested all the time.
Well, people think, I don't care what people think about me. This is an axiom that is absolutely true. If you're afraid to get arrested, then they already have you under control. They don't have to worry about you.
Okay.
Because they manipulate you with your fear. But see, when the officer says, Mr. Hill, if you don't stop this or stop that, I'm going to take your ass to jail. My response is, son, I have been sentenced to 160 years in the Texas penitentiary. And if you think I'm afraid to go to your little chicken stuffed jail, you're crazy. I got friends there. I'll see people that I know. I'll see people that admire and respect me. I have somebody to talk to, including officers, have a lot of regard. They think I've got a lot of courage. But let me tell you something, the line between courage and stupidity is very narrow.
Yes, sir.
But if you're afraid to go to jail, don't go. Monday, I'm going to sit down with a young man that just picked up a nickel, I believe in Fort Bend County, and or maybe Brazoria County, and he and I are going to sit down, and I'm going to teach him how to survive his trip to prison. All right?
Yes, sir.
And now he's 20, 21 years old. And of course, you know what he's thinking about.
Yeah.
That ain't what's going to happen, because that happens very rarely. But I train people how to survive prison. And I was sentenced to 160 years, went down there, and my thing was, how do I survive this? Not meaning, how do I live till I get out? Because when you got 160 years, you don't think about getting out. And then after I got that down, which took me about 2 weeks, I said, how do I prosper here? And I did. I prospered very well. So I take that technology and share it with people who are afraid.
Okay.
You ought to listen to my show. Well, you do listen to my show, you said.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Good to have you out there. And if I'm doing something wrong, call me. I don't mind being corrected.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. I need to say something about this T-shirt. Ken Wenzel gave me this T-shirt because he heard that I shopped out at Kmart on Westheimer, and he wanted to make sure that whenever they did all that arresting out there, that I wouldn't get arrested. And cops always do what they read in stencil, and it said, "Do not arrest this person," so I didn't get arrested. You're on the air.
Hey, Ray, how you doing?
They treat me well.
Oh, I said, my name is John.
Okay, John.
And I was locked up on Darrington Unit for right at 15 years.
No, well, I think I'll be down to Ramsey Trustee Camp tomorrow doing a recovery meeting.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you, man, for what you do for all the guys behind walls, prisons, and we need people like you to let society know that a person can change.
Well, I'm just another old convict who can't forget. They just give me the 1 minute sign. Let me wrap up, and I'll talk to you on the radio.
All right, tell everybody, give a shout out to everybody on the Darrington Unit for me.
I'll do her.
All right.
Bye-bye, John. Give a shout to everybody on the Darrington Unit. That's what I do most of the time. If you haven't listened to Prison Show for about an hour, we talk about cops and courts and jails and prison, probation, parole in the first hour. And then second hour, I got wives, mothers, children, and ex-convicts and lovers and boyfriends and fathers calling in to give my convicts a few words of encouragement. Everybody deserves some encouragement. My name is Ray Hill, and I've been doing what I've been doing all of my life because my mama expected me to rub the cat hair the wrong direction. If you're going to go where folks get arrested, get one of these T-shirts, wear it. Cops always obey what they read in stencil. This is Public Affairs, Public Access. I'm Ray Hill, and I'll be back next month, and hope you can find an occasion to join me. Life is good. Celebrate, but not to excess. If you're a habit of celebrating to excess, I'll see you at AA meeting soon. Bye-bye.